Stepping outside onto a Victorian street at night was not the cinematic moment modern people imagine. No warm golden glow, no welcoming streetlights, no comforting hum of distant traffic. It was more like stepping directly into a poorly lit stage production where the set designer had run out of budget for lighting. Hello travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Imagine this. You've spent the entire evening indoors under the warm flicker of candles, maybe an oil lamp if you're fancy, squinting at embroidery, or pretending not to see the questionable stains on the wallpaper. Then you open your front door, take one confident step forward, and immediately lose the ability to see anything. Your pupils, previously enjoying the cosy dimness of indoor life, now fling themselves into a state of panic, widening like you've suddenly become nocturnal. This transition wasn't gentle. Your eyes needed a moment, sometimes several moments, to figure out what on earth they were supposed to be looking at. The first 10 seconds outside belonged entirely to guesswork. Was that a person walking toward you or a horse tied to a post? Is that a cart or a particularly ambitious pile of garbage? Did you just see a shadow, or is your brain filling in the blanks like a stressed-out painter? The Victorian night wasn't just dark, it was confusing, dramatic, and borderline philosophical. Many Victorians likely had at least one nightly existential crisis just trying to find their own doorstep again. The thing is, you couldn't rely on street lighting to save you. Gas lamps did exist, yes, but they were about as bright as a modern phone screen when it's on 1% battery. They produced a kind of hesitant glow, a soft halo that illuminated a very specific 3-foot radius. Everything outside that radius? Good luck. Your field of vision turned into a Victorian vignette, the centre visible, the edges fading to black like a portrait that refused to load all the way. This meant that for those first few minutes outdoors, your primary survival tool wasn't sight, it were memory. You had to remember where the road was. Remember how many steps it took to reach the gate. Remember whether the neighbour's cat had a habit of sleeping directly on the stoop, waiting to trip unsuspecting pedestrians with the eagerness of a furry assassin. In a strange way, navigating the nighttime street was like playing a real-life Victorian version of The Floor is Lava, except the lava was horse manure, puddles, or something your mind refused to identify. And let's not forget the moon, because Victorians didn't. Without reliable artificial lighting, the night sky was their weather forecast, calendar, and flashlight all in one. A full moon? Perfect for a stroll. A new moon? Congratulations. You've been plunged into what could reasonably be mistaken for a haunted coal mine. On cloudy nights, people genuinely reconsidered their evening plans. Not because of danger, though danger was always around the corner, but because walking outside required the kind of nerve and determination usually reserved for heroic quests. Moon dependency shaped everything. On bright nights, families visited neighbours, young couples went for walks, and shopkeepers stayed open a little longer. On dark nights, entire streets shut down early. Activities ended not when people were tired, but when the last sliver of moonlight vanished. The sky dictated civilization's bedtime. If the moon was full, the streets looked relatively lively. If it wasn't, even the bravest souls hurried home before the world turned into black void with occasional lantern-shaped hope. And if you were unlucky enough to step out on one of London's special nights, the foggy ones, your eyes never adjusted at all. But we won't delve into fog yet. That's for another chapter. For now, we'll stick to the pure, unadulterated darkness of a typical Victorian evening, where every street felt like a half-finished sketch, and every shadow looked like it had personal motives. The early moments outside also came with a strange sense of vulnerability, as if stepping into the night meant temporarily resigning yourself to nature's questionable judgment. Indoors you had barriers, walls, doors, curtains, a fireplace crackling like an old man clearing his throat. Outdoors, you had cold air, dim lighting, and a sense that anything could be lurking nearby. Criminals, stray animals, or your neighbour's child who enjoyed staring silently from behind fences like a tiny Victorian ghost. Street noise didn't help your adjustment period either. You'd go from the relative quiet of your home to a soundscape of distant shouting, carriage wheels grinding over cobblestone, heavy boots slamming pavement, and the occasional inexplicable clang that made you reconsider going back inside forever. It was like your eyes and ears staged a rebellion simultaneously, demanding better working conditions. There was also the psychological shift. Indoors, you were a respectable Victorian person. Outdoors, in the dark, you became a cautious, squinting creature shuffling forward with the confidence of someone trying to find the bathroom at 3 a.m. without waking anyone. Your posture changed, your breathing changed, your sense of dignity took a brief vacation. So yes, stepping outside at night in the Victorian era wasn't just a moment. It was an experience, a multi-layered sensory challenge. A brief but mighty battle between human biology and pre-electric urban design. Before the night fully revealed itself to you, those first moments belonged to confusion, disorientation, and the undeniable suspicion that your eyes were lying to you. If you ever find yourself romanticizing Victorian gas lamps, imagining them as soft, warm halos guiding nighttime wanderers like little luminous guardians, stop right there. Gas lamps were indeed charming in their own outdated way, but calling them bright is like calling a Victorian doctor sanitary. Technically true by contemporary standards, but deeply misleading by ours. The glow of a gas lamp didn't so much illuminate the street as gently suggest the idea of light, like a shy candle afraid of drawing too much attention. You could see the lamp itself beautifully. Everything else around it remained a mystery. To understand why these lamps behaved the way they did, you need to look at how they worked. Inside each lamp was a burner, essentially a glorified metal tube, connected through pipes to a central gasworks. Coal gas, produced by heating coal in giant retorts, travelled through a network of underground pipes to each lamp. Once the lamplighter opened the valve and lit the mantle, the gas ignited and created a flame shielded by glass. Simple enough in theory, but in practice, Victorian gas systems were about as reliable as a drunk horse. They functioned, but sometimes only in spirit. Coal gas by nature burned with a slightly yellowish hue, which gave Victorian streets that iconic amber tint. It looked picturesque, but it wasn't exactly helpful if you needed to actually see it. The area directly beneath a lamp formed a tiny bubble of light, while the edges quickly dissolved into darkness. It was bright enough to show you where the lamppost was, but not bright enough to prevent tripping over your own shoes 2 steps away from it. And because these lamps were spaced far apart, lighting authorities had budgets after all. The street formed a strange rhythm of light and dark. Bright circle, darkness. Bright circle, darkness. It was almost poetic if you were in a contemplative mood, but absolutely infuriating if you were trying to find your keys. The gaps between lamps weren't just dim, they were borderline invisible. Anyone walking the streets at night got used to this pattern, adjusting their steps like a person navigating a series of spotlights. Of course, gas lamps didn't come cheap. Lighting a city required massive amounts of coal, enormous machinery, miles of metal pipes, and a battalion of lamplighters risking their lives to keep everything glowing. Cities paid substantial annual fees to gas companies, which were always eager to remind municipalities how revolutionary their lighting was, despite the occasional explosion or blackout. Meanwhile, ratepayers grumbled about costs rising because the mayor wants to see after 6 p.m. This is where lamplighters entered the picture. Victorian society's unofficial nighttime celebrities. If you lived in a large city like London, Edinburgh or Manchester, you might see dozens of them every evening, marching down the street like a solemn, yet slightly soot-covered parade. Each carried a ladder, or in later years, a long lighting pole with a tiny flame at the end. And they moved from lamp to lamp with practiced rhythm. Their job required skill, balance, and the willingness to climb metal poles in all weather conditions while carrying fire, gas valves that sometimes hissed ominously, and tools that were probably older than they were. They lit each lamp by opening the valve, holding the pole to the burner, and hoping nothing exploded. Then, hours later, Depending on the city's policy, they'd return to extinguish them, often well after midnight in the dark, stepping carefully to avoid puddles with questionable content. Despite the danger, lamplighters became beloved figures. Neighbours waved to them, children admired them, dogs, for reasons known only to dogs, barked at them with unwavering enthusiasm. Some lamplighters were so well known that specific districts considered them local personalities. Like the friendly barista of today, only instead of coffee they provided not dying in the dark. Their presence made people feel safer, even though the lamps barely illuminated anything beyond the immediate post. Lamplighters weren't just lighting experts, they were walking maintenance crews. They checked burners, cleaned glass globes, tightened fittings, and occasionally wrestled with pipes when the gas pressure dropped. They knew which lamps were temperamental, which ones flickered dramatically in the wind, and which ones had a history of breaking at inconvenient times. If a lamp developed a leak and emitted the faint smell of gas, the lamplighter would be the first to notice. If a lamp caught fire in a way it absolutely wasn't supposed to, he was also the first to panic, but professionally. The glow itself varied from lamp to lamp. Some burned steadily, emitting a calm amber light that pedestrians could trust. Others flickered aggressively as if the flame was having an emotional crisis. Gusts of wind caused the light to waver like a candle trying to survive a toddler's birthday party. When rain hit, lamps steamed up, glass fogged, and visibility decreased even further. Snow piled on top of lamps, dimming them like nature's very own dimmer switch. Victorian technology was impressive for its time, but it definitely had moods. The true irony: many Victorians loved the gaslight ambience. It was atmospheric, dramatic, even romantic. If you ignored the parts where it failed to prevent crime, accidental falls, or collisions with wandering livestock. Writers adored describing gaslight glow in novels. Artists painted it obsessively. Courting couples took evening walks under it, pretending not to need to squint. Yet despite all its charm, gaslight represented a sort of half-modernity. Bright enough to show a path, but not bright enough to conquer the night. Strong enough to replace darkness, but not strong enough to erase it. It was civilization's compromise with nature, a truce rather than a victory. And for all its flaws, it transformed cities. It made evenings livable, it made nightlife possible, and it gave the Victorian night its unmistakable character, a world of solos, pockets of amber light, and the quiet footsteps of lamplighters who carried long poles, tall ladders, and a glowing promise that the dark would give way, at least for a few precious feet. If the Victorian night had a pre-show and an opening ceremony, or a warm-up act before the darkness officially took over, it was the lamplighters' twilight parade. Every evening, often precisely timed, sometimes loosely approximate, depending on the discipline of the local gas company, these men walked through the streets with long poles tipped with flame, climbing hooks, or, for the more acrobatically inclined, ladders slung across their shoulders like steel crosses of municipal responsibility. The lamplighters' shift didn't begin when the sun set. It began about an hour before sunset, when the sky was still fading from afternoon brightness, but the shadows had begun creeping in like early guests at a party. The lamplighters' job was to anticipate darkness, not chase it. The goal? To ensure that when the night fully arrived, the street would not be plunged into complete, so bone-chilling mystery, but instead would have tiny islands of flickering civilization ready for use. Their routine followed a near-sacred rhythm. Start at one end of the district, light the first lamp, then proceed to the next, and the next, and the next, until the entire stretch of road became a dotted line of amber flames. For pedestrians and shopkeepers, this parade was the evening entertainment. People leaned out their windows, paused at their doors, or took their time sweeping their steps just to catch the ritual. Children followed lamplighters as if they were the Pied Piper, except instead of playing a tune, they carried fire and muttered complaints about gas pressure. Lamplighters often had the same routes for years, sometimes decades. A man could spend his entire working life walking the same streets, knowing exactly which lamp needed a firmer twist of the valve, which one sparked reluctantly like a moody teenager, and which corner post required a small prayer every time you approached it. The lamplighter was part technician, part caretaker, part performer. His evening tools varied depending on era and technology. In earlier decades, he carried a ladder and climbed up to each lamp, opening the glass panel and igniting the burner with a handheld taper. Later innovations allowed him to carry a long pole with a trigger mechanism for lighting and extinguishing the flame without climbing, sparing him from the eternal danger of ladders meeting slippery cobblestones. This brings us to the dangers of the job, because romantic as the image may be, lamplighting was not a profession for the faint of heart. Climbing a ladder while holding fire was already questionable at the best of times. Doing it in the Victorian night, where the roads were uneven, horses galloped past unpredictably, and drunken citizens occasionally mistook the lamplighter for a talking lamppost, was downright heroic. And then there was the weather. Rain made the ladder slick. Snow made the rungs icy. Strong winds could blow out the flame just as the lamplighter reached the top, forcing him to climb back down, relight his tool and climb again while muttering language inappropriate for polite Victorian society. Fog, especially the thick industrial kind, made it impossible to see the next lamp, let alone the puddle 2 inches in front of your foot. Lamplighters learned to orient themselves by their instinct, smell, and the familiar shape of nearby buildings emerging from the haze. Gas pressure failures were common, and when the flame wouldn't catch, the lamplighter had to fiddle with the valve, coaxing it like a tired animal. Sometimes a sudden burst of gas created a mini fireball that singed eyebrows, moustaches, and the lamplighter's will to live. A good lamplighter didn't just maintain lamps, he survived them. But despite the hazards, the lamplighter enjoyed a curious social status. They weren't wealthy, most were firmly working class. They weren't powerful, they had no authority beyond the ability to suggest someone step away from the pole, please. Yet they held a position of respect. Everyone knew them. Everyone relied on them. And in an age when the night was a treacherous unknown, these men were the bringers of light, literal and symbolic. What made them even more beloved was their uncanny ability to collect gossip. Because the lamplighter walked the same route every day at dusk and dawn, he became a repository of community knowledge. He knew which neighbours argued the loudest, which shopkeepers stayed open too late, who courted whom quietly in the shadows, which houses secretly replaced their curtains, and which dogs had declared war on the local postman. If the town had news, chances were high that the lamplighter knew it before the newspaper did. Their early morning extinguishing rounds were particularly rich gossip-gathering missions. Passing through the streets at dawn, they saw who had come home late, who had left early, which taverns had patrons staggering out at sunrise, and which households seemed unusually quiet or unusually lively. The lamplighter was not just a worker, he was a nocturnal observer, a walking rumour mill whose mere presence could start conversations. He also learned the rhythm of the city intimately. He knew where the cobblestones dipped, where the pavement cracked, which alleyway funneled wind like a natural trumpet, and which intersection always smelled vaguely of cabbage. He could walk the route in pitch darkness, which, let's be honest, he often did because Victorian nights didn't exactly cooperate. Children idolised lamplighters. For them, a man walking around creating light with a stick might as well have been a wizard. Some households even offered small treats, a cup of tea, a roll, a warm greeting, especially on cold nights when the lamplighter looked like a frozen statue with a job to finish. Adults, meanwhile, treated the lamplighter with a blend of admiration and pity. Admiration for the bravery, pity for the hours and weather. The parade ended only when every lamp in his district was lit and glowing. The final moment, stepping back, hands on hips, surveying the newly illuminated road, was practically ceremonial. Then he moved on to the next street, and the next, until the whole neighbourhood had been transformed into a constellation of tiny amber stars. And so the Victorian night officially began. Victorian nighttime wasn't simply dark, it was strategically dark. It wasn't a smooth blanket of night that gently covered the city. It was a patchwork quilt stitched together by uneven illumination, confused pockets of brightness, and shadows that were far too enthusiastic about their role in the urban drama. If the day belonged to the living, the night belonged to the shadows, stretching, bending, twisting, and behaving in every way except normal. Once the last lamplighter disappeared and the gas lamps flickered into their gentle glow, the street transformed into a theatre set where the lighting director had only mastered the on and off switches, but had never learned anything in between. Gas lamps illuminated what they touched directly, but everything outside that narrow spotlight fell into dramatic obscurity. This meant that Victorian streets weren't lit evenly like ours. They were more like a series of tiny stages separated by thick curtains of darkness. Each lamp created a glowing circle, and just beyond its edge lay a thin, murky band where shadows clung like gossip, present, persistent, and always ready to distort what you thought you saw. That liminal space, where light tried its best and darkness refused to leave, became the playground of illusions. One moment you'd see a perfectly normal doorway. The next, the shadow from an oddly angled broom would convince you the Grim Reaper had clocked in early. Victorians, whose eyes had to fight for every scrap of available light, were particularly vulnerable to these visual deceptions. You know that feeling when you walk around your house at night and the coat you left on a chair suddenly looks like a lurking intruder? Multiply that sensation by 100, add questionable air quality, mix in moonlight filtered through coal dust, and finish with the fact that your main source of illumination was a single flickering gas lamp 20 feet away. The result: a nightly experience where even the bravest citizens clutched their walking sticks just a little tighter. Silhouettes were the real villains of the night. A simple human figure standing innocently at a corner could transform into something monstrous when stretched by the lamp behind it. A man tipping his hat might project a shadow the size of a giant greeting you aggressively. A horse tied to a post could cast a silhouette that looked suspiciously like a mythical beast that Victorian children had been warned about. And heaven help you if your local butcher had decided to hang anything outside to dry. Meat hooks and shadows do not mix. Because the shadows were so sharp-edged and dramatic, everything looked intentional even when it decidedly wasn't. A loose shutter banging in the wind threw moving shapes onto the street. Laundry swaying on an upper balcony created the silhouette of a ghastly figure floating mid-air. A cat walking along a roofline became a witch, a demon, or, worst of all, a Victorian mother-in-law arriving unannounced. Cats, in fact, deserve special credit for terrorising nighttime pedestrians. These creatures, already dramatic in daylight, became shadow puppeteers of chaos after dusk. They darted across beams of lamplight, leaving behind elongated, slinking shapes that followed unsuspecting pedestrians like a low-budget horror effect. A cat jumping off a fence projected a monstrous blur on the wall, causing more than one Victorian to shriek, drop their bread, and assume the supernatural had finally come to collect dues. The combination of gaslight flicker and unpredictable shadows also made movement incredibly disorienting. A shadow could appear to rush toward you simply because the flame inside a lamp danced, shifting the angle of illumination. Wind gusts made the lamps flicker wildly, turning every person, animal, and object into a shape-shifting entity. Imagine trying to walk calmly while your own shadow suddenly stretched across the entire street like it was trying to outrun you. Many Victorians became intimately familiar with the sensation of seeing something move out of the corner of their eye, only to realise it was their hat. Architectural features didn't help either. Victorian buildings were full of decorative ridges, chimneys, crenellations, railings, pillars, and other protrusions that caught the light at odd angles. What looked like a friendly family home during the day could, at night, resemble a Gothic-haunted mansion where unspeakable things gathered. A simple corner shop might cast a hulking, distorted outline that towered over the street like it was auditioning for a role in a ghost story. And Victorians, being Victorians, had no shortage of imagination. They grew up with ghost tales, spiritualism, folklore, and warnings about wandering spirits who preferred to lurk in, where else, shadows. So when the darkness played a trick on someone's brain, the brain happily cooperated. People saw phantoms in alleyways, headless figures in doorways, and faceless silhouettes leaning against lampposts, only to discover it was someone waiting for a carriage or a stray coat hung up for airing. Shadows also had a habit of swallowing things whole. Something dropped. Good luck finding it. A coin could bounce into the darkness and vanish permanently, like the street had eaten it. A glove? Gone. A letter? Lost to the abyss. Even respectable pedestrians sometimes disappeared into shadowy doorways so completely that passers-by wondered whether they had been claimed by the night itself. The Victorian night played with human perception constantly, stretching shapes, blending edges, exaggerating proportions, and creating forms that didn't exist. It was a world where certainty evaporated and the imagination filled the void, often with hilarious or terrifying results. And while some Victorians prided themselves on being rational and modern, even they were not immune to the tricks of the dimly lit street. In short, Victorian streets after sunset were less calm nighttime environment and more interactive psychological experiment conducted by the lighting industry. Every corner held a mystery, every shadow had personality, and every single person walking at night had, at least once, sped up because they swore something was following them. If you ever fantasized about a peaceful Victorian night, one of those gentle, quiet evenings where the world sleeps and the only sound is the soft rustle of leaves, forget it immediately. Victorian cities did not sleep, they barely napped. The night was less a tranquil silence and more a full orchestra warming up for a performance no one asked for, conducted by chaos, with percussion provided by things falling off carts. The very ground beneath your feet seemed to vibrate with noise. The cobblestones echoed like an enormous xylophone every time a horse passed by, amplifying the rhythm of hooves into a clattering heartbeat that pulsed through the street. A single wagon could sound like a small earthquake, and these weren't smooth, well-oiled wagons gliding gracefully over a modern road. They were wooden contraptions with loose bolts, squeaky axles, and wheels that wobbled ominously, screaming with every rotation. The soundtrack of a Victorian night often began with a familiar slow creak. 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 As if the wagon were complaining about being awake just as much as the driver was. Behind it came the horses, hard-working, unsupervised, and definitely louder at night than during the day. The clopping of hooves wasn't just rhythmic, it was dramatic. A horse walking calmly sounded like an approaching night. A horse trotting sounded like imminent doom. A horse running turned the street into an action scene, with pedestrians leaping out of the way like extras trying not to ruin their costumes. And because many carriages didn't have muffled wheels, nighttime transportation often sounded as though the world's angriest drummer had chosen to rehearse directly beneath your bedroom window. But horses weren't the only animal vocalists of the night. Cats ruled Victorian cities after sundown, and they were not subtle about it. Their nighttime screeching could make even the bravest resident leap 3 feet in the air. 2 cats arguing over territory sounded exactly like a murder in progress. One cat singing the song of its people, for reasons known only to cats, could send an entire street into silent panic, followed by the inevitable realization, just felines filing complaints. Dogs chimed in occasionally, barking at absolutely nothing. Perhaps they barked at shadows, or at the moon, or at the moral decay of society. No one knew, least of all the dog, but their lonely echoing barks travelled far through the quiet, bouncing between buildings like acoustic messages of canine dissatisfaction. Overlaying the animal chorus was the ever-present grind of nighttime labour. Many Victorian workers continued long after sunset, and what they lacked in light, they made up for in noise. Bakers started kneading dough before dawn, slapping bread against wooden tables with a steady thump, thump, thump that echoed out open windows. Street vendors packed up their stalls at odd hours, clattering crates, banging metal lids, and loudly debating the day's profits with the energy of men who had consumed far too much cheap ale. Blacksmiths finishing late-night repairs added sharp metallic rhythms, hammer strikes ringing out in bursts that made the whole neighbourhood aware of exactly how many hits it took to shape a horseshoe. Newspaper printers churned away deep into the night, their machines clacking and thudding, like mechanical beasts gnawing on endless paper. Even tailors and cobblers worked under lamplight, creating a soft background murmur of scissors, thread, and the faint scrape of leather. And every so often, piercing through the clutter of urban noise, came the shrill whistle of the night watchman. These whistles were meant to reassure civilians, though they often startled people more than any danger would. A long, sharp whistle meant, all is well. A series of short whistles might signal a minor problem. An excited, shrieking whistle meant either a criminal or that the watchman had stepped into something unmentionable. You never knew which. Footsteps were another constant companion. Victorian shoes were not designed for stealth. They clicked, clacked, tapped and thudded depending on the material. Workers trudged home, dragging their souls like exhausted zombies. Gentlefolk walked briskly, their heels sharp and precise. Policemen moved in a distinctive slow, heavy rhythm that people recognised instantly, but that shadowy figures preferred to avoid altogether. Even children had their nighttime sound, the quick pitter-patter of barefoot scurrying when they were supposed to be asleep. Then there was the human noise, the shouting, laughing, arguing, bartering and occasionally singing. Drunk patrons leaving taverns belted out songs with the enthusiasm of performers and the pitch accuracy of geese honking. Groups of friends debated politics loudly enough to wake sleeping chimney sweeps. Couples whispered under lamplight, thinking no one could hear them, everyone could. Somewhere down the street, two neighbours might engage in a heated dispute about noise, ironically, making more noise in the process. Layered beneath all this was the steady hum of a living city. Even when no single sound stood out, the air itself buzzed faintly. People moving behind closed doors, fires crackling, water sloshing through pipes, wagons shifting in stables, and the soft, constant murmur of life refusing to sleep. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was how Victorians reacted to all this noise. They got used to it. For them, this nighttime cacophony wasn't disruptive, it was comforting. The familiar clatter of wheels meant commerce. The watchman's whistle meant safety. The distant bellow of a drunk meant the tavern was still open for business tomorrow. Life had a rhythm even at midnight. Victorian nights were not quiet, but they were alive, filled with sounds that reminded everyone they were part of a bustling, breathing city. And whether you found it thrilling or exhausting, one thing was certain. The night never truly belonged to silence. Before professional police forces were fully established, and while Victorian cities were still figuring out the logistics of nighttime safety, one group of men served as the unofficial guardians of the dark, the night watchmen. These men patrolled the streets armed with lanterns, staffs, whistles, and a surprising amount of vocal enthusiasm. They were the walking, shouting security system of the era, part timekeeper, part guard, part human alarm clock, and part town gossip with a badge. If you lived in a Victorian neighbourhood, you didn't need a clock to know the time. You had a watchman. Every hour on the hour he proclaimed it loudly enough for the street to hear. 12 o'clock and all is well. 1 o'clock and a fine clear night. 2 o'clock and let's pretend everything is still fine. The logic behind this practice was simple. By shouting the time, the watchman assured residents that he was awake, alive, and actively patrolling. The implication was that if he wasn't shouting, something was very wrong. He'd been knocked out, bribed, or eaten by a particularly ambitious goat. People found comfort in those regular cries echoing down the street. Today we might call them sleep disturbances. Victorians called it security. The night watchman's responsibilities extended far beyond yelling. He was expected to walk the same beat every night, inspecting doors, windows, and gates to ensure they were shut. In many towns, it was common for watchmen to gently test doorknobs as they went. This wasn't considered intrusive, it was considered helpful. Imagine a stranger shaking your front door at 1 a.m. to make sure it's locked, and you feeling grateful. That was the Victorian mindset. So, Watchmen also carried tools that helped them perform their duties. The lantern was their primary companion, a small metal-framed light they swung from one hand, illuminating the pavement ahead in a quivering pool of yellow. Unlike gas lamps, which offered a fixed circle of steadyish glow, the watchman's lantern bounced with each step, making the shadows around him jump and stretch dramatically. Anyone seeing that bobbing light approach in the darkness instantly knew it was either a watchman or something mysterious trying to borrow the aesthetic. The watchman's staff was both a symbol of authority and a practical weapon. Criminals knew that watchmen were rarely armed with anything more dangerous than a long wooden stick, but they also knew the stick hurt. The staff was also used for tapping shutters or knocking on doors if the watchman needed to warn someone about suspicious activity or an open window. His whistle, however, was the true emergency device, a sharp, piercing tool that could summon help, or at least momentarily terrify anyone within 200 feet. One of the more surprising duties of watchmen was fire detection. Victorian cities were flammable nightmares. Wooden houses, coal stoves, candles, and fabrics left near heat sources combined into an environment where fire wasn't an accident. It was an expectation. Watchmen were trained to look for smoke, sparks, or suspicious glows behind curtains. Their whistles often signalled not crime, but the start of a frantic bucket brigade. It was not uncommon for a watchman to suddenly sprint down the street shouting, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" while every dog in the neighbourhood joined the chorus. They also served as emergency responders long before such things existed. If someone fell ill during the night, the family might flag down the watchman, who was expected to summon the nearest doctor, usually by knocking insistently on the doctor's door until he woke up or accepted defeat. If a tavern brawl spilled onto the street, the watchman intervened. If someone wandered home drunk and collapsed in a doorway, it was the watchman's job to at least make sure they were breathing. Sometimes he'd drag them out of the way so residents wouldn't assume a corpse was blocking their entrance. Despite their solemn responsibilities, watchmen were often characters, colourful, chatty, and deeply familiar to the locals. Because they walked the same streets every night, they noticed everything. They knew whose chimney always smoked at odd hours, whose cat disappeared nightly, which neighbours whispered too much, and which houses suspiciously went dark whenever rent collectors came around. They could detect patterns in a community's behaviour like a proto-neighbourhood surveillance system, except with significantly more commentary. This intimate knowledge made them reliable witnesses and informants for early police forces. When the Metropolitan Police was formed, many watchmen were absorbed into the new system because they already knew the neighbourhoods like the backs of their soot-stained hands. Others proudly resisted, continuing their traditional rounds as long as cities would fund them. For many Victorians, trust in watchmen ran deeper than trust in the new uniformed officers. After all, the watchman knew your grandmother, your habits, your favourite bakery, and exactly how loudly your uncle snored through open windows. The strange thing was that despite all the noise, hourly shouting, lantern rattling, staff tapping, people still considered the watchman's presence reassuring. The noisy routine was proof that the world continued to function in the dark. Each shout of the hour was a check-in from the universe. Everything is normal, nothing terrible has happened yet. Go back to sleep. Of course, this didn't stop Victorian babies, pets, and light sleepers from waking up every time the watchman announced, 3:30 and all is well. But the alternative silence was far scarier. So the night watchman marched on, lantern swinging, staff clicking, voice booming, a guardian of streets that needed protection whether they admitted it or not. His role bridged the gap between medieval watchmen and modern police. He wasn't just a man walking in the night. He was the sound of nighttime security, echoing between brick walls and gaslit corners, reassuring the world that someone was awake. If the Victorian night had a personality, it would greet you before you even saw it, not with a handshake, but with a smell. In fact, Victorian nighttime air didn't simply smell. It introduced itself, marched boldly into your nostrils and declared, "Good evening. Welcome to the era before standardized sanitation." The scent of the night was a multi-layered experience, a bewildering fragrance wheel that ranged from cozy to horrifying, sometimes within the same breath. The moment you stepped outside, the first thing your lungs encountered was coal smoke. It was everywhere, floating, drifting, hanging low, like it had nowhere better to be. As evening fell, countless households lit their fireplaces. Chimney sweeps finished their shifts, and factories wound down, all contributing to the nightly smog buffet. Each home's coal had its own distinct flavour, some sharp and biting, some mellow and smoky, others accompanied by a subtle hint of burning something that should absolutely not be burning. On a clear night, coal smoke formed a delicate haze. On a busy night, it formed a cloud thick enough to qualify as garnish. As you inhaled your third lungful of this atmospheric soup, a pleasant aroma might weave its way through. Roasting chestnuts. Street vendors were busiest in the evening, tending to their cast-iron braziers as they roasted every Victorian's favourite winter snack. The smell of chestnuts, warm, sweet, earthy, floated through the streets and tangled beautifully with the crisp air. For a brief moment, it fooled you into thinking Victorian nights were charming, wholesome, and maybe even magical. But that feeling was temporary. Continue walking and the next scent might be fried eel, hot potatoes, or cheap puddings steaming in carts, street food that drifted through the night like edible ghosts. Depending on the vendor, this smell ranged from mouth-watering to mildly alarming. Some stalls produced aromas that made passers-by salivate. Others produced mysterious vapours that made them cross the street. But even the questionable ones had their charm. They reminded Victorians that a warm and hopefully safe meal was never too far away. Just as your senses were adjusting to the culinary offerings, something far less appetising would slip into the mix. Garbage. Victorian cities did not have the luxury of efficient waste removal. During the day, trash accumulated in alleys, gutters, behind shops, and sometimes right in the street. At night, when the wind slowed and the air cooled, these piles released their presence gently but persistently. Rotten food scraps, spoiled vegetables, discarded fish bones, and the lingering odour of things that had been fruit last week all blended to form a spell that made even the hardiest noses reconsider breathing. And then there was the horse manure, an aroma so constant that it became part of the background scenery. Horses were everywhere. Horses pulled cabs, hauled goods, carried riders, and strolled through the streets with the confidence of creatures who knew they would always remain essential. Their droppings decorated the pavements and cobblestones like nature's unwanted confetti. Rain spread it, wheels crushed it, boots stepped in it, and the smell rose gently in the night air, reminding everyone that transportation came with biological consequences. But wait, before your senses could fully recover, there came the ghost of something truly unforgivable: the sewer vent. Victorian sewage systems were works in progress, and drainage was not always consistent. Sewer grates and ventilation shafts dotted the streets, releasing occasional aromatic surprises at unexpected moments. You might be enjoying a stroll when suddenly, whoosh, a gust of warm, foul-smelling air burst from beneath your feet, announcing itself with the confidence of a guest who arrived without knocking. This particular scent had layers, sulphur, rot, moisture, and a hint of mystery. The mystery being, what on earth is down there? The answer was always nothing you want to think about. Victorian sewer vents had a sense of humour, popping off at the most inconvenient moments, during romantic walks, while passing a group of respected neighbours, or, cruelest of all, directly into your open mouth if you made the mistake of talking. Then, drifting between all of these scents like a soft veil, came the smell only Victorians truly understood: fog. Fog in Victorian cities wasn't clean or crisp. It was a gentle smothering of moisture mixed with soot, factory dust, chimney smoke, and whatever else floated around that day. The fog carried scents with it, stretching them, blending them, muting them, or intensifying them. A foggy night was like stepping into a giant damp nose. Everything smelled stronger, stranger, closer. Add to that the smell of damp wool coats, wet leather boots, street dogs shaking off water, breweries emptying barrels, ironworks cooling and oyster stalls closing for the night, and you had a scent landscape that was vivid, chaotic and unforgettable. What made this olfactory symphony unique was its inconsistency. Turn a corner and the centre pastries might greet you. Take 2 steps and you're hit with industrial smoke. Move again, and you're face to face with the pungent reminder that horses have no concern for your nasal comfort. Victorians didn't just breathe the air, they endured it. They adapted. They accepted these smells as part of urban life. For them, nighttime scents weren't nuisances but signposts. Smoke meant warmth, manure meant commerce, chestnuts meant street vendors were working, fog meant weather was shifting, and sewer bursts meant, well, keep walking. The night smelled like life itself, messy, unpredictable, fragrant in some parts, horrifying in others, and entirely unforgettable. Victorian fog was not the poetic, gently swirling mist that modern films like to pretend it was. No, Victorian fog was a full-blown atmospheric ambush, a sentruder that descended from the heavens, or more accurately, from the chimneys, with all the subtlety of a stage fright attack. It didn't creep in politely, it invaded. And once it arrived, the entire street might as well have transformed into a blindfolded obstacle course designed by someone with a grudge against pedestrians. Natural fog had always existed in Britain. Its moist maritime climate practically encouraged it, but the Victorians took fog to a new, theatrical level. They added the one ingredient nature never asked for: industrial pollution. When natural mist mingled with coal smoke, chimney soot, furnace fumes and factory exhaust, the result was the notorious pea souper, a fog so thick, so yellowish and so overwhelming that the air didn't just look dirty, it felt dirty. People didn't walk through pea soupers, they waded through them like air had suddenly become a flavour. Night times, of course, made everything worse. In daylight, a fog was merely unpleasant. After sunset, it became a shapeless void where sight, sound and sanity quietly packed their bags and went on holiday. Victorians would step outside expecting a familiar street and instead find themselves inside what looked like a giant bowl of grey soup that someone had forgotten to stir properly. The experience began with the shifting of visibility. In clear weather, the nearest gas lamp might be visible from 30 or 40 feet away. In a fog, you could stand directly beneath a lamp and still struggle to see its metal post. Instead of casting light into the street, the lamp turned into a shimmering halo with no body, like a ghost auditioning for the role of optimistic streetlight. Everything beyond arm's length vanished into pale oblivion. The fog swallowed sound too. Footsteps sounded softer. Wagon wheels echoed strangely, bouncing around in unpredictable ways. A conversation a few yards away might sound surprisingly distant, while a far-off sound, like a horse neighing, could suddenly seem right next to you. Nothing was where it was supposed to be. The world became a poorly tuned radio station, full of static, distortion, and eerie surprises. Even lifelong residents who could navigate their district blindfolded, and often did given the scant lighting, found themselves disoriented. Familiar landmarks disappeared. Buildings dissolved into vague shapes. Distances warped. A walk to the corner shop, usually a simple left turn, 10 steps, a greeting to the owner and another 10 steps home, became a journey of guesswork and prayers. People would step carefully, hands outstretched, hoping to feel a wall, a doorframe, or anything solid to anchor themselves. Every few feet someone bumped into something unexpected. A water pump, a lamp post, a startled neighbour, or in rare but memorable cases, a cow that had wandered into the street with the confidence of a fog enthusiast. The fog also had a notorious habit of turning shadows into living nightmares. Shapes blurred, edges softened. The silhouette of a passing figure could look like a creature with elongated limbs. An ordinary street sign might loom like a headless spectre. Many Victorians, already raised on ghost stories and spiritual anxieties, or they saw phantoms drifting through the fog, gossamer figures that dissolved when approached. More often than not, These tapretes were just overcoats hung on outdoor hooks or laundry left overnight by someone who underestimated the weather. But fog didn't just confuse pedestrians, it disrupted the entire rhythm of the city. Carriages slowed to a crawl, their drivers squinting uselessly into the void. Horses, relying on instinct alone, walked with unusual caution, their usual confidence replaced by suspicious sniffing of the ground. Deliveries ran late. Taverns stayed open longer because patrons refused to step into the vaporous abyss. Even thieves hated thick fog, not because it hid them, but because it hid everything, including potential targets, alleyway exits, and occasionally the ground itself. The fog was also a great equalizer. The wealthy, usually accustomed to wide, clean streets, felt just as lost as the poor navigating the city's narrower alleys. Even the lamplighters, those seasoned veterans of the twilight hours, found themselves fumbling through their routines, their lights barely piercing the haze. Night watchmen shouted the hour, but the sound arrived oddly delayed, as if reluctant to travel through the thickness of the air. Residents would hear 12 o'clock and all is well, emerging like a distant echo, inspiring confidence only because the watchman's courage to yell in such conditions must have been immense. The unpredictability of fog meant that Victorians developed a peculiar relationship with it. They feared it, mocked it, complained about it, but also accepted it as a recurring houseguest who never left on time. Merchants checked the sky. Factory owners cursed their chimneys. Housewives muttered about laundry disasters. Children vanished joyfully into fog banks like they were entering another dimension. The worst were the fogs that arrived unannounced, dropping suddenly and trapping anyone caught outside. One moment the air might be clear, the next minute visibility dropped to inches. These surprise fogs were notorious for causing minor accidents, people falling into gutters, stepping into puddles that felt like miniature oceans, walking into each other, or going home with the wrong group of friends simply because all humans looked identical in this Victorian soup. And as if nature and industry weren't already doing enough, the fog loved to mix with night moisture, creating a thin, clammy film on every exposed surface. Clothes absorbed it, hair curled in it, walls dripped with it. Even gas lamps struggled, sometimes flickering, sometimes dimming entirely, swallowed by the gloom. The air tasted like damp coal. Breathing felt like inhaling warm wool. And yet life continued, because Victorians were nothing if not stubborn. For all its reputation, fog became part of the nightly identity of Victorian streets, a moody character that transformed ordinary nights into surreal mazes, confusing, damp, annoying, and unforgettable. If the Victorian daytime market was a lively chorus of commerce, then the night market was its slightly dishevelled, sleep-deprived cousin, energetic, chaotic, wonderfully fragrant in parts, suspiciously fragrant in others, and determined to squeeze every last coin out of anyone with a craving after dark. This twilight economy came alive precisely when respectable households were drawing curtains and preparing for bed, transforming shadowy streets into bustling pockets of sizzling pans, clattering carts, bellowed bargains, and aromas that tugged unsuspecting pedestrians in every direction. Night vendors were a different breed from their daytime counterparts. They were resilient, opportunistic, and, above all, fast. They thrived on impulse purchases. Their customers were late-shift workers, hungry drinkers staggering home, courting couples stretching out their evenings, and insomniacs wandering the streets hoping to stumble upon something edible and reassuring. For these clientele, the night market was a lifeline, the Victorian equivalent of a 24-hour convenience store, just with significantly fewer safety standards and substantially more smoke. One of the kings of the nighttime streets was the oyster vendor. You might imagine oysters as a luxury food, but in the Victorian era they were astonishingly cheap, so cheap that they were practically the currency of the masses. Oyster stalls glowed beneath small oil lamps, the vendors' faces lit like dramatic stage actors preparing for their monologue. They would open shells with expert flicks, offering the oysters raw, stewed, fried, or tossed with vinegar and pepper. You could hear the crack of shells several yards away, a rhythmic punctuation to the evening air. And while oysters were delicious, they were also unpredictable. The Victorian sewer system was in its experimental phase, meaning that an oyster might be fresh, spoiled, or something between those two states that defied scientific classification. Eating one required courage, faith, and in some cases, a written will. If oysters weren't your style, you could turn to the comforting glow of the roasted potato cart. These vendors roasted potatoes in iron barrels packed with hot coals, sending out waves of heat that were irresistible on cold nights. The smell alone could revive a person's will to live. A perfectly roasted Victorian potato had a crackling skin and a steaming, fluffy interior that made the entire night feel warmer. People carried them like edible hand warmers. Of course, the potato might also be mildly burnt, undercooked, or seasoned with whatever ash and coal dust happened to drift by, but that was part of the thrill. Then there were the fried fish sellers, offering slices of battered fish sizzling in pans of oil that had seen more nights than the vendor himself. The aroma was divine, the hygiene debated. Fish balls, fried herrings, and fish sandwiches passed from hand to hand, fueling workers and wanderers with salty, crunchy confidence. Children adored these stalls, doctors did not. On the sweeter side of the night market, gingerbread sellers hawked spiced, honey-glazed biscuits shaped into hearts, animals, or abstract blobs that one prayed were animals. Candy boys walked the street with trays strapped to their shoulders, offering peppermint sticks, toffee lumps, and violet sweets wrapped in paper that stuck to everything. Meanwhile, baked apple vendors ladled out steaming apples boiled down with cinnamon and sugar, their scent wafting far enough to convince even the most stoic adults to hand over a penny. The night market wasn't just about food, it was also a place of entertainment. Street musicians carved out their own glowing spots beneath lamps and doorways, filling the night with violins, fiddles, penny whistles, and the occasional accordion threatening to swallow its player whole. Their tunes ranged from lively folk songs that inspired spontaneous dancing, to mournful ballads that made everyone momentarily reflective before going back to their potatoes. Children clapped along, drunk men sang terribly, and couples pretended to enjoy the music while actually enjoying the chance to stand closer together. Hawkers added verbal flair to the scene, shouting deals with the confidence of auctioneers who had neither rehearsed nor prepared. They barked prices, teased competitors, and sometimes invented new words on the spot if it meant drawing attention. A skilled hawker could sell outdated bread as yesterday's premium loaf, or pass off bruised fruit as pre-softened for your convenience. Yet for all its vibrancy, eating at the night market was always a gamble. Victorian food regulations were, shall we say, optional. Vendors reused oil until it turned into a bubbling potion with mysterious properties. Meat pies might contain beef, pork, lamb, or something the vendor described vaguely as meat adjacent. Oyster freshness depended on the vendor's moral compass, and roasted chestnuts occasionally hid small surprises like pebbles or accidental ash clusters. Every bite came with the question, will this nourish me, or will this become a story future historians tell with concern? Despite these risks, or perhaps because of them, the night market played an essential role in urban life. It fed the hungry, it warmed the cold, it provided comfort to shift workers. It offered a social space for those who didn't belong in drawing rooms or fancy restaurants. It was where labourers mingled with clerks, where gossip spread faster than heat from a potato cart, where children tugged their parents' sleeves for treats, and where everyone shared a brief, bustling moment under the dim light of the street. While daylight markets offered abundance and respectability, the Victorian night market offered something else entirely: spontaneity. It was where the city's true personality came alive, smoky, flavourful, unpredictable, and absolutely unforgettable. The Victorian street at night may have had dim lighting, unsettling shadows, and unpredictable smells, but nothing kept pedestrians truly alert like the constant threat of being flattened by a horse, or a carriage, or, on particularly unlucky evenings, both at once. urban nighttime traffic was not a peaceful procession of gentle clopping hooves. It was a chaotic ballet performed by animals who didn't read rulebooks and drivers who hadn't invented the concept of slowing down. Victorian cities didn't have traffic lanes, crosswalks, stop signs, or any hint that safety was a priority. The street was simply a long stretch of cobblestone where humans, horses, carriages, wagons, handcarts, goats, because goats had opinions, and the occasional runaway wheel all scrambled to coexist. During the day, this system functioned through sheer momentum and mutual fear. At night, it became a gamble. The first challenge for any nighttime pedestrian was hearing the traffic before seeing it. Gas lamps illuminated only tiny islands of space, and fog or darkness consumed everything else. A carriage could be 5 feet away before a pedestrian realised it, emerging from the gloom like a fast-moving wooden beast with lantern eyes. People walked cautiously, ears tuned for the telltale sounds of hooves on cobblestone. The rhythmic clop, clop, clop that echoed down a Victorian street wasn't charming. It was a warning. Move, unless you want hoof prints where your legs used to be. Horses themselves were unpredictable, even on their best days. They were trained, yes, but they were also animals navigating dimly lit streets while pulling heavy loads. They stumbled, they balked, they accelerated randomly. They got distracted by stray dogs, interesting smells, or the existential dread of being a Victorian working horse. Their vision wasn't perfect, especially in poor lighting, meaning that at night, pedestrians weren't just dodging traffic, they were dodging half-blind animals running on instinct and questionable motivation. Cab drivers added their own brand of chaos. These men were the unofficial sailors of the street, loud, confident, and eager to shout at anything that moved. They cracked whips, clicked their tongues, and yelled, "Cab there! Cab, cab!" into the night like a Victorian version of a modern taxi horn. Their goal was to attract customers, but their voices also served as a surprisingly effective early warning system. If you heard a cabman shouting before you saw the cab, that was your cue to shuffle to the nearest building and plaster yourself against the wall like a nervous Victorian gecko. Some cabmen prided themselves on speed. They navigated corners with theatrical flair, leaning into turns with one arm flung out for balance, shouting directions at their horses as if participating in a competitive sport. Nighttime amplified this energy. Fewer pedestrians meant more room to accelerate. Customers stumbling out of taverns meant business. And the combination of high spirits, low lighting, and bumpy cobblestones meant that the occasional cab ride felt like being launched across the city in a wooden box powered by enthusiasm. Then there were the delivery wagons, slow but deadly. These lumbering giants rolled through the streets carrying barrels, sacks, crates, and occasionally chickens who had not volunteered for transport duty. Their wheels rattled loudly, their loads shifted ominously, and their drivers, exhausted, half asleep, and barely visible atop their high seats, often relied on the horse to navigate the street. If a wagon cornered unexpectedly, pedestrians had to move with surprising agility, embracing the Victorian equivalent of parkour to survive. Nighttime crossings required strategy. The first step was picking a spot without large puddles or recent manure. The second was listening for approaching hooves. The third was taking a deep breath and walking briskly, while hoping the horse approaching from the left was trained enough to slow down and the one approaching from the right wasn't in the middle of an existential meltdown. Speed was essential, but so was caution. Many Victorians developed a sort of urban shuffle, a quick sideways scurry perfected over years of avoiding hooves. But the greatest danger wasn't the obvious traffic. It was the surprise arrivals, the carriage rounding a blind corner with no lanterns lit, the horse trotting freely because the driver had stopped for a snack, the milk cart whose bells were muffled by fog, the butcher's runaway pony making a spontaneous bid for freedom. At night, unpredictability wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a frequent visitor. Add to that the fact that cobblestones were slippery when wet, uneven in places, and riddled with cracks deep enough to eat a human ankle. Horses slipped, carriages jolted, wagons wobbled. On rainy nights, The street became a glossy hazard zone where everything with wheels or hooves moved like it was participating in an ice skating competition without consent. Pedestrians developed habits to cope. Some carried lanterns. Others walked closer to the buildings, using the walls as shields. Parents held their children tightly, as children had a tendency to wander into the street with the confidence of beings who had never been trampled. Even pets were kept close, because Victorian dogs, though brave, had an alarming tendency to chase horses for fun. Despite the hazards, nighttime horse traffic was woven into the fabric of city life. It brought goods, moved people, kept commerce alive, and filled the streets with the constant hum of movement. Victorians were accustomed to dodging danger. They expected it. They worked with it, danced around it, and in many cases laughed about it afterwards, especially if someone else was the one who nearly died. To walk the Victorian night was to accept that sorrow evil required a sharp ear, quick reflexes, and a willingness to treat horses like unpredictable meteorological phenomena, dangerous, unstoppable, and occasionally majestic. When most Victorian households settled in for the evening, pulling curtains tight, banking fires, and praying the neighbours wouldn't start a domestic argument at full volume, another population of the city was just clocking in. For the urban working class, nighttime wasn't a quiet pause in the daily grind. It was a second shift, a different world, a bustling underground of labourers who kept the city running while the more privileged majority slept peacefully on mattresses stuffed with feathers, hopes, and a surprising amount of dust. These nighttime workers weren't fringe characters, they were essential. Without them, the morning routines of Victorian society would collapse faster than a poorly constructed tenement roof. Bread would not appear on breakfast tables. Newspapers would not land on doorsteps. Coal fires would not be stoked. Deliveries would not arrive. And the next day's commerce would stumble into chaos like a drunken cab driver missing his horse. The most iconic members of this nocturnal workforce were the night bakers. Bread was serious business in Victorian Britain, practically its own food group, moral philosophy, and political battleground. Households expected fresh loaves every morning, which meant bakers had to begin their work before dawn. Long before the sun even considered rising, night bakers were rolling up their sleeves, firing ovens, kneading dough with rhythmic expertise, and shaping loaves by the dozens. Their bakeries glowed warmly in the early hours, radiating heat that spilled into the street like a beacon for anyone lucky enough to pass by. The scent of baking bread drifted onto the cold cobblestone, creating a comforting aroma that night watchmen, lamplighters, and exhausted labourers quietly envied. Inside, bakers moved with sleepy determination, folding dough, stoking ovens, and trying not to accidentally nap face first into a bowl of flour. Their shift ended just as the city awoke, meaning most Victorians never even saw them, but they absolutely tasted the results of their labour. Not far behind were the newspaper printers, an army of ink-stained men who turned nighttime hours into tomorrow's headlines. Victorian newspapers were ravenous beasts that needed constant feeding. Updates on politics, crime reports, serialised fiction, advertisements, letters, and public announcements. Printers worked through the night to set type by hand, arrange pages, operate steam-powered presses, and churn out thousands of copies before sunrise. Their workplaces were loud, hot, and chaotic. Machines clattered. Metal type rang, paper flew everywhere. Ink smeared onto hands, clothes, and occasionally faces, creating a workforce of men who looked permanently tattooed with the news. But the printers took pride in knowing that the city depended on them for information. In a world before radio, before TV, and long before the internet, printers were the unseen narrators of Victorian life. Then there were the coal workers, whose job description could be summarised as move heavy black rocks all night with minimal complaint. Coal was the fuel of the Victorian universe. It powered factories, heated homes, lit lamps, and enabled nearly every urban convenience. Someone had to haul it, someone had to sort it, someone had to transport it from docks to homes, from coal yards to shops, from warehouses to factories, and often that someone was a worker trudging through the night, pushing a handcart that weighed more than he did. Coalmen stacked, shoveled and delivered during absurd hours because early morning households expected their scuttles full long before breakfast. Their footsteps were unmistakable, a slow, heavy trudge accompanied by the scraping of carts and the soft avalanche-like sound of shifting coal. These workers were rugged, strong, and permanently dusted in black, looking like spectres emerging from alleyways, but they were the backbone of the industrial city. Joining them were the delivery boys, the fleet-footed teenagers responsible for transporting everything from baked goods to printed papers to urgent parcels. They darted through the streets with enthusiasm, weaving between horse traffic, dodging puddles, and carrying bags that seemed ridiculously oversized for their small frames. Their work was vital, and because boys were cheaper to hire than men, Victorian businesses took full advantage of their speed and affordability. They became the city's nighttime messengers, part courier, part sprinter, part acrobat. Other trades thrived after dark as well. Butchers often prepared meat for morning markets during the night, sawing, slicing, and hoisting carcasses in cold back rooms lit only by small lanterns. Chimney sweeps sometimes worked nighttime jobs clearing flues for factories that needed to operate at dawn. Milkmen journeyed from dairies on the outskirts of the city toward town centres before sunrise, their carts clinking softly as bottles jostled. Alongside them were the night cleaners, street sweepers who scraped debris, shovelled refuse and cleared away the daytime mess so that morning shoppers could pretend urban life was orderly. These workers appeared like ghosts in the gloom, their brooms moving in long, rhythmic strokes as they gathered the trash nobody wanted to acknowledge existed. Nighttime labourers didn't just keep the city functioning, they formed a hidden society with its own rhythms, jokes, camaraderie, and quiet understanding that they were doing the work others preferred not to think about. They passed each other on regular routes, a baker heading home as a coal cart rolled by, a printer stepping outside for air just as a delivery boy sprinted past, a street sweeper nodding to a milkman at the same hour every morning. Their world was dim, gritty, loud and exhausting, and yet essential. Without these invisible workers, Victorian mornings would collapse into disarray. No breakfast, no news, no warm homes, no clean streets. Civilization relies on unseen hands, and in the Victorian era, those hands were often working when everyone else was asleep, dreaming comfortably in beds made possible by someone else's sleepless night. If Victorian streets were theatres after dark, then the sex trade was one of the biggest and least openly acknowledged production running every night. It operated in the margins, in alleyways, behind curtained windows, inside boarding houses, and on shadowed street corners where transactions were fast, hushed, and shaped by a mixture of survival, desperation, and the unforgiving economics of the age. This wasn't the glamorous, romanticised version that painters later tried to depict. This was a gritty industry born out of poverty and maintained by the cold realities of urban life. For thousands of Victorian women, nighttime sex work wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was an act of survival in a society that offered limited options and even fewer safety nets. Servant jobs paid poorly, factory work was brutal and inconsistent. Many women found themselves abandoned, widowed, unemployed, or simply too economically vulnerable to survive on honest wages alone. The nighttime trade filled the gap, becoming an unofficial social system with its own hierarchy, rules, dangers, and rhythms. On the lower rungs of this hidden economy were the street walkers, the women you would see on corners, leaning against lampposts or pacing short stretches of pavement. They worked in the semi-dark, relying on their voices or silhouettes to catch attention. Their territory was precious real estate. Specific corners, alleys, and building fronts controlled either by informal agreements among the women or by third parties who enforced these boundaries more aggressively. Their negotiations were quick and discreet. A whispered question, a nod, a subtle glance toward a darker alley or a nearby doorway. Privacy was almost never guaranteed. Many encounters took place in cramped lodging houses, narrow mews, or the shadowed edges of courtyards where any passing footstep might interrupt. But for many women, speed mattered more than comfort. Every minute spent lingering on the street came with the risk of police harassment, predatory clients, or rival pimps. Above them in the hierarchy were brothel workers, employed in establishments tucked discreetly between respectable shops or behind unmarked doors. Brothels themselves varied wildly, from small dingy rooms rented by a madam to large, well-furnished establishments that catered to wealthier clientele. Had velvet curtains and perfumed hallways. Others had peeling wallpaper and beds that complained loudly with every movement. But madams kept their businesses running with clockwork precision, managing customers, protecting their workers to varying degrees, bribing officials, and maintaining a reputation that balanced secrecy with accessibility. Inside these brothels, the women had slightly more protection compared to those on the streets. They had indoor space, other workers nearby, and a structured system for screening clients. But the work was still grueling, dangerous, and shaped by the exploitative economics of the trade. Many women owed debts to their madams for clothing, food, or lodging, a cycle that trapped them as effectively as any legal system could. Hovering around the edges of this world were the pimps, sometimes called bullies, protectors, or keepers, who claimed to manage the affairs of street-based workers. Their presence varied by district. In some neighbourhoods, pimps monitored territory fiercely, demanding payment in exchange for keeping an eye out. In others, they acted as enforcers, chasing off threatening clients or rival sellers. But their protection came with its own dangers: coercion, financial exploitation, and violent consequences for disobedience. Many women operated independently to avoid becoming entangled with them, though doing so meant risking their own safety. The police, their relationship with the nighttime sex economy was complicated and often hypocritical. Officially, prostitution was not illegal in Victorian Britain. What was illegal were the activities around it: soliciting, running brothels, public indecency, disturbance. This created a loophole wide enough to drive a horse-drawn omnibus through. Authorities could arrest women for standing in a manner deemed to invite immorality, a description so broad it could theoretically apply to anyone waiting for a late-night potato cart. Yet despite these laws, enforcement was wildly inconsistent. Some officers cracked down aggressively, conducting raids or marching women to police stations for their own good. Others turned a blind eye in exchange for informal payments, or simply because they understood that shutting down one brothel wouldn't stop the trade, only relocate it. In certain districts, brothels were so well known that local police nodded to madams as they passed, treating the establishments like unspoken fixtures of the street. Meanwhile, society maintained a double standard large enough to illuminate with a gas lamp. Newspapers condemned prostitution as a moral scourge. Politicians railed against its corrupting influence. But during the quiet hours of night, men from every social class, clerks, sailors, students, businessmen, even the occasional gentleman, slipped into the same streets they publicly denounced. Respectability by day did not prevent indulgence by night. Amid this moral hypocrisy, women working in the nighttime economy developed their own networks of resilience. They watched out for each other, warned about dangerous clients, shared food when someone hadn't eaten, and sometimes slept in shifts to ensure no one was caught unaware by police or thieves. Their camaraderie was an unspoken sisterhood built on mutual struggle, whispered advice, and the constant need for vigilance. Street corners formed social ecosystems of their own. A woman might work the same pitch for years, recognizing the same passers-by, chatting briefly with vendors closing their stalls or exchanging nods with lamplighters. She might know which alleyways were safest, which pubs let her use the back entrance, which tobacconist stayed open late enough to offer warmth by its doorway. Her knowledge of the street was survival, intimate, intuitive, and forged through hardship. For all the hardship and stigma, the sex trade was deeply woven into the nighttime fabric of Victorian cities. It was hidden in plain sight, acknowledged by everyone, condemned by many, and yet relied on by the same society that pretended it didn't exist. It was an economy shaped by poverty, demand, inequality, and the harsh reality that nighttime in the Victorian era was as much about seeking survival as it was about seeking opportunity. Victorian nights would not be complete without their most chaotic recurring cast members, the drinkers. It didn't matter if the street was foggy, dimly lit, slippery, crowded, haunted by suspicious shadows, or patrolled by sleep-deprived watchmen. Somewhere in the city, a tavern door was always swinging open, releasing a fresh wave of laughter, arguments, off-key singing, spilled ale, and citizens walking with the posture of men attempting to defy gravity itself. If the gas lamps defined the look of Victorian nights, then the taverns defined the soundtrack. Loud, messy, and gloriously unpredictable. Alcohol wasn't just part of Victorian nightlife, it was the engine powering it. Taverns, alehouses, gin palaces, and public houses were everywhere, like Starbucks today, but with much worse life decisions. They ranged from respectable establishments serving polished mahogany counters and imported spirits, to grimy corner pubs where the tables wobbled, the floor stuck to your boots, and the drinks were strong enough to make a chimney sweep see stars. Inside these taverns, nighttime took on a life of its own. After-hours crowds gathered to unwind from long shifts, dock workers, clerks, sailors, bricklayers, millworkers, apprentices, carriage drivers, and the occasional gentleman sneakily slumming it for authenticity. Taverns were one of the few places where class lines blurred, if only through shared intoxication. Alcohol was the great social equalizer, meaning everyone was equally likely to fall over. The atmosphere inside ranged from cheerful to anarchic. Patrons swapped gossip, argued about politics, debated the weather, bragged about non-existent accomplishments, mourned their wages, or toasted to anything that could remotely justify another drink. In the corner, someone played a fiddle or sang a ballad with the emotional intensity of a performer at the Royal Opera House, despite missing half the notes and slurring the rest. Groups clapped along enthusiastically, even when they had no idea what rhythm was anymore. Closing time was when the true chaos began. Unlike modern pubs with strict shutdown hours, Victorian taverns operated on a flexible schedule, meaning drinks often stopped flowing only when the owner decided they'd earned enough money, or someone, usually multiple someones, had finally passed out. As customers spilled into the street, the peace of the night evaporated in an instant. Suddenly, the evening's calm was interrupted by slurred singing, hearty bellowing, and dramatic reenactments of arguments no one would remember in the morning. The wobbly walk home was a nighttime ritual. Drunks zigzagged across cobblestones, argued with lampposts, saluted chimney pots, and practiced the ancient art of leaning against walls to avoid gravity-related disasters. Some walked with determination, like soldiers marching into battle, albeit in the wrong direction. Others meandered in slow spirals until the night watchman gently steered them toward their own street, muttering prayers for their safe arrival. Drunken groups were louder, rowdier, and significantly more committed to singing patriotic songs at top volume. Their laughter echoed between buildings, bouncing from window to window like a contagious nighttime virus. Not that Victorians necessarily hated drunks, they were simply a predictable, if occasionally annoying, part of the night. But the hazards were real, falling into gutters, tripping over uneven stones, colliding with carriages, or dozing off against someone's front door like an unwanted but very heavy wreath. And then there were the alley fights, a regular feature of Victorian nightlife. These weren't always serious brawls. Sometimes they were dramatic performances fueled more by ale than anger. Arguments might erupt over spilled drinks, insulted pride, political disagreements, or the simple fact that someone looked at someone else's hat for too long. Shoving became punching, shouting became wrestling, and soon two grown men were rolling on the cobblestones while bystanders cheered, placed bets, or quietly slipped away to avoid involvement. Eventually one man stumbled off victorious, and the loser went in search of another pint to soothe his injuries. But not all tavern-related trouble was humorous. Victorian alcoholism was a genuine social crisis, fueled by poverty, harsh working conditions, and limited access to clean water in certain districts. Gin, in particular, haunted the drinking culture, a holdover from the previous century's gin craze. It was cheap, potent and dangerously easy to overconsume. Many labourers drank not for recreation, but to numb the grind of daily life. Some used alcohol to cope with chronic pain from factory injuries or to suppress hunger when wages were too low to buy poor food. Women too were involved in nighttime drinking, though society judged them much more harshly. A man stumbling out of a pub was just blowing off steam. A woman doing the same was labelled immoral or hopeless. Still, in working-class neighbourhoods, taverns were some of the few places where women could socialise outside the home, even if it came with risks. Police and night watchmen handled drunken disruptions with a mixture of patience and resignation. If someone sang too loudly, they were gently escorted home. If someone became aggressive, they might spend the night in the station's drunk tank, also known as a badly ventilated holding cell filled with snoring strangers. But most of the time, authorities preferred practical solutions. Walk them home, convince them to sit down, or simply wait until the offender fell asleep on a stoop long enough to become harmless. Despite the dangers, taverns served as informal social centres. They were where workers bonded, where news travelled, where friendships formed and where humour thrived. Drunken singing and wobbly walking may have annoyed neighbours, but they were also markers of life, signs of a city that refused to sleep quietly. The Victorian night wasn't just defined by silence and shadows. It was shaped by laughter echoing off brick walls, songs slurred into the smoky air, footsteps stumbling home, and the unpredictable, endearing, occasionally hazardous drama of people making memories they would absolutely forget by morning. The Victorian night was many things: foggy, noisy, grimy, unpredictable, but above all it was an opportunity, not for respectable citizens who spent most evenings praying they wouldn't twist an ankle on a loose cobblestone, but for the city's criminals, who regarded the darkness as their personal playground. To them, the night wasn't something to survive. It was something to use, a tool, a weapon, and sometimes a convenient excuse when things didn't go as planned. "Officer, I swear I thought that was my pocket." Crime levels surged after sundown, not because Victorian criminals were more enthusiastic than their daytime counterparts, but because the environment practically begged for mischief. Dim lighting, uneven shadow, loud distractions, and a general sense of nocturnal confusion created the perfect ecosystem for thieves, footpads, and burglars to thrive. And thrive they did, strolling through the darkness with the confidence of men who had learned long ago that gas lamps illuminated absolutely nothing useful. The most common nighttime troublemakers were the footpads, the street muggers who specialised in separating pedestrians from their valuables, with efficiency ranging from mildly intimidating to impressively theatrical. Footpads preferred narrow lanes, alley mouths, and the edges of marketplaces where the lighting evaporated entirely. They worked in pairs or small groups, often orchestrating their ambushes with whispering coordination. One man distracted the victim, usually with a polite question like "got the time?", while the others appeared behind him, often wielding sticks or koshes. Victims rarely saw them coming. How could they? The street ahead looked like solid darkness, and by the time shapes emerged from the void, it was too late to do anything except rethink their life choices. Next on the criminal roster were the pickpockets, whose craft bordered on artistry. These nimble-fingered miscreants thrived in nighttime crowds outside taverns, theatres, night markets, and popular cab stands. Under the dim glow of gas lamps, a pickpocket could slip a hand into a coat, pocket, or reticule with a practiced ease. Their movements were delicate, precise, and astonishingly quick, made even easier by the fact that their victims were often distracted, tired, tipsy, or blinded by shadows. Many pickpockets learned to use the flickering lamplight to their advantage. They positioned themselves so that their targets cast their own shadows over their bodies, hiding the thief's hands as effectively as any cloak. The city's burglars approached their nighttime profession with the dedication of craftsmen. Victorian architecture, full of tall windows, flimsy back doors, and easily climbable drain pipes, was practically designed for nighttime intrusion. Burglars chose houses by studying their routines: which families went to bed earliest, which servants slept on which floor, which homes had loud dogs versus dogs that only pretended to care about intruders. Once a target was selected, burglars struck at the quietest hour, often between midnight and 3 a.m, when even the tavern crowd had dwindled and the watchmen were on their slower, sleepier rounds. Burglars carried lockpicks, cloth bags, small lanterns shaded to direct only a sliver of light, and occasionally rope ladders. They moved silently, except when they didn't, which happened more often than anyone admitted. Many burglaries ended not with daring escapes, but with comedic mishaps. Thieves stepping on cats, tripping over boots, knocking over chamber pots, or fleeing in terror after mistaking a hanging coat for a ghost. The humour of Victorian crime is one of history's lesser discussed treasures. Consider the thief who tried to pickpocket a man only to discover he was a police sergeant in plain clothes, or the burglar who climbed into a window, slipped, and landed directly onto a sleeping bulldog. Or the 2 footpads who attempted to rob a stranger in the dark, only for all 3 of them to walk straight into a lamppost moments later. Crime was profitable, yes, but also occasionally slapstick. Still, far more sinister figures prowled the night as well. Violent robbers, organised gangs, and opportunistic thieves took full advantage of patchy lighting and slow police response. The uneven pools of yellow lamp glow created natural hiding spots. Criminals lurked behind barrels, under staircases, in recessed doorways, or beneath carts left overnight. In these shadows, they watched for victims walking alone, especially those clutching parcels, purses, or freshly withdrawn wages. Many criminals developed nighttime strategies based around listening rather than seeing. They learned to identify bootsteps, carriage noises, and drunken off-key singing. A staggering pedestrian meant an easy target. A fast walker with deliberate steps meant someone who wasn't worth the trouble. A group laughing loudly meant distraction, ideal for pickpockets. A silent set of footsteps behind them meant another thief competing for the same victim. Authorities struggled. Victorian policing was understaffed, undertrained, and frequently overwhelmed. Streets that looked reasonably safe during the day transformed into labyrinths of shadow and danger at night. Police patrolled slowly, swinging their lanterns and scanning alleys, but even the bravest constables admitted privately that the nighttime belonged to the people who knew how to navigate it best. And those people were rarely the innocent. Crime at night wasn't just opportunistic, it was systemic. The social inequalities of the era, poverty, lack of work, homelessness, hunger, drove many into the criminal underworld. The night was simply the only shift when their profession became feasible. For some it was survival, for others it was thrill, for many it was both. Yet for all the fear nighttime crime generated, there was also an odd Victorian acceptance of it. People avoided dangerous areas, stuck to well-lit paths, travelled in pairs, or carried sturdy walking sticks just in case. They prepared for nighttime crime the way modern commuters prepare for train delays, annoyed, resigned, and unsurprised when it happened. The darkness did not create criminals, but it made them bolder, faster, and sometimes unintentionally funnier. It turned the streets into a stage where danger and comedy mingled, where a thief might make a clean escape or faceplant directly into a cabbage cart. Such was the Victorian night, unpredictable, hazardous, and teeming with characters who came alive the moment the sun went down. When the Metropolitan Police was established in 1829, the idea was revolutionary. A modern, organised, uniformed force patrolling the streets to keep citizens safe. In practice, however, the early Victorian police were more like confused mole security guards dropped into a citywide obstacle course, with a lantern, a whistle, and the hope that criminals would be too startled by their shiny new buttons to commit crimes. These early officers had to patrol some of the darkest, most chaotic streets in Europe, with hardly enough manpower to cover half of them. Many districts were so understaffed that a single constable might be responsible for a patrol route that took over an hour to walk. Longer if he stopped to question suspicious characters, redirect a lost drunk, or help remove a sheep blocking a public thoroughfare, which astonishingly happened more often than reports would like to admit. The uniform was supposed to inspire trust, but at first it mostly inspired confusion. Early officers wore dark blue tailcoats, tall stovepipe hats, later replaced by the now iconic custodian helmets, and polished buttons that glinted in the lamplight like hopeful little stars. They carried rattles at first, wooden noisemakers that sounded like someone vigorously shaking a bag of bones, before adopting whistles later in the century. Their truncheons were short, sturdy clubs designed more for waving threateningly than for actual combat, which was fortunate because most officers' combat training consisted of hit the bad guy and hope he goes away. Their authority, however, was not universally respected. When police forces first appeared, many Victorians reacted with deep suspicion. People believed these new bluecoats were spies of the government, agents of tyranny, or simply unnecessary busybodies. Some working-class neighbourhoods saw them as intruders into traditional ways of handling trouble, namely yelling loudly until someone's uncle intervened. As a result, early patrols were met with heckling, pranks, thrown vegetables, sarcastic bows, or pointed remarks about their lack of speed. And the lack of speed was real. Early police patrols moved with a deliberate, measured pace. They weren't meant to chase criminals so much as discourage them by existing, but criminals were unimpressed. The darkness gave thieves a tremendous advantage, one that was not improved by officers carrying lanterns that announced their approach from a mile away. Hearing the clatter of an approaching constable was like hearing a dinner bell. Criminals simply vanished into the night, slipping behind buildings, ducking into alleyways, or standing completely still in the shadows until the officer wandered past. Patrol routes were predictable. Officers marched up one street, turned the corner, walked down the next, and continued in a squares and grid fashion that could be easily memorized by anyone with malicious intentions, or even by bored teenagers. A constable might walk the same path every night for years, becoming a moving landmark as reliable as church bells or the smell of morning bread. Criminals quickly learnt the timing. If Constable Higgins passed the pub at 11:07 every night, then 11:15 was an excellent window for opportunistic pocket-picking. But even when the police were present, they had a peculiar challenge, seeing anything at all. Armed with small lanterns that cast feeble circles of light, they often found themselves squinting into the gloom, trying to determine whether a shape in the distance was a suspicious figure, a runaway horse, a trash heap, or simply a trick of shadows. Many early reports contain phrases like, "I apprehended what I believed to be a vagrant but discovered it was a discarded coat," or "The suspect escaped due to extremely low visibility." Officers preferred walking near gas lamps for obvious reasons: light, warmth, and the reassurance that they weren't about to step into a gutter or collide with an unexpected barrel. Yet the lamplight also distorted reality, making it hard to judge distances or identify faces. Someone loitering innocently beneath a lamp might appear suspicious, while an actual criminal lurking just outside the glow could remain practically invisible. Despite these handicaps, the police did maintain a presence that citizens gradually grew to appreciate, even if begrudgingly. If you were walking home at night and saw a constable at the end of the street, lantern in hand, with uniform glinting, you felt at least a little safer. Unless, of course, you were in a neighbourhood where criminals vastly outnumbered officers, in which case seeing a constable felt more like spotting a rare endangered species passing through unfamiliar terrain. Many households still preferred the lock your doors and pray method of nighttime security. They bolted shutters, checked latches twice, and relied heavily on sturdy front doors. Some families invested in watchdogs, others carried canes or walking sticks when venturing out. A few kept old family swords or loaded muskets, just in case, though using them usually ended with disastrous collisions, startled neighbours, or accidental property damage. Police stations themselves were small, cramped outposts, little more than rooms with desks, a few holding cells, and piles of paperwork documenting the city's nightly misadventures. Officers returned from their patrols with reports of shouting brawls, wandering livestock, suspicious shadow, drunken serenades, or citizens who insisted that they had seen ghosts. In some districts, officers spent more time breaking up tavern arguments than catching actual criminals. Yet over time, the police gained experience. They adapted to the rhythm of the night, They learned which alley was a hotspot for pickpockets, which corner attracted trouble after taverns closed, which blocks needed extra attention when fog rolled in. They formed relationships with local vendors, night workers and residents, weaving themselves into the fabric of the nighttime city. Still, the Victorian night remained a force that even the police couldn't fully control. Darkness, fog, shadows, and the sheer unpredictability of urban life meant that officers could only be in one place at a time, and crime had a habit of occurring everywhere else. So while their presence comforted many, half the city still believed that the safest nighttime strategy was simple: lock the doors, bank the fire, listen for strange noises, and hope the constable walking his route was having a particularly attentive night. If daytime Victorian streets belonged to commerce, chaos, and clattering wheels, then nighttime belonged to the animals. Not the refined, well-groomed pets sitting beside fireplaces in respectable parlours, no. Night was the reign of the strays. The four-legged residents of the city emerged with the confidence of creatures who knew exactly how to survive urban life without paying rent, taxes, or any attention to human rules, while citizens bolted their doors, fed their hearths, and prayed for an uneventful night. The city's stray dogs and cats clocked in for their own shift, scavenging, prowling, fighting, howling, and generally behaving like the unofficial rulers of the nocturnal streets. Let's begin with the stray dogs, the loudest, boldest, and most opinionated creatures of the Victorian night. Packs roamed freely through alleys and open spaces, moving with the loose coordination of animals who shared territory, but not necessarily teamwork. These dogs weren't pampered lap pets, they were survivors. Lean, scrappy, and infinitely resourceful, they knew every butcher's back door, every market stall still holding scraps, and every rubbish pile fresh from the evening's discards. Some dogs were former pets abandoned due to poverty. Victorian households often released animals when the men could no longer afford to feed them. Others had been born into the streets, baptised by the sound of clattering wagons and the scent of old fish bones. Whatever their origins, they learned quickly that night-time was prime hunting hour. When the city quieted, they moved like furry shadows, noses low, tails up, sniffing for anything edible, or questionably edible, which was usually good enough. Food scraps were the feast of the night. A tipped-over bucket behind a tavern, gold mine, a roast shop's bins after closing, treasure trove, unwatched baskets of bread cooling near an open window, invitation accepted. These dogs had incredible timing, bakers, cooks, and vendors frequently found teeth marks in items that had been unwatched for mere seconds. The word unattended to a Victorian stray dog simply meant available, but strays weren't silent. Oh no, they held territorial meetings, loud ones. Whether they barked to defend turf, challenge rivals, or simply express existential frustration, these sounds echoed through the night like canine declarations of ownership. A single bark could trigger a chain reaction, bouncing across streets as dozens of dogs added their opinions. Residents lying in bed would sigh, roll over, and mutter something along the lines of, "Not again," because stray dogs didn't care whose sleep schedule they ruined. Then there were the fights, loud, dramatic, and often preceded by a tense standoff complete with low growls and the Victorian equivalent of, "You looking at me?" These scuffles rarely resulted in serious injury. Dogs knew better than to risk lasting harm, but they certainly did result in noise, scrabbling paws, snapping jaws, startled yelps, and the unmistakable shuffle of dogs settling their differences before returning to their scavenging. Not to be outdone, cats ruled the rooftops, fences, and narrow alleys. If the dogs controlled the ground, cats governed everything above knee height. Victorian cities had enormous cat populations, because where there was food waste and vermin, there were felines. They slipped through the shadows like silent phantoms. Their movements lit only when they crossed through a gas lamp's glow and revealed their reflective eyes, glittering twin orbs that startled more than a few nighttime wanderers. Cats were the true acrobats of the night. They leapt from ledges, squeezed through iron railings, strutted along rooflines, as comfortably as pedestrians walked pavements. And they were noisy, but in a uniquely feline way. Their nighttime screeching, whether caused by territorial disputes, romantic overtures, or disagreements over a particularly delicious trash pile, rang through the night with impressive volume. To an unsuspecting listener, these sounds often resembled a person being attacked, a baby crying, a demon screaming, or all three at once. Many a Victorian citizen bolted upright in bed thinking, someone is dying outside, only to realise, nope, just cats being cats. Territorial battles between male cats were a nocturnal tradition. Two tomcats might face off beneath a lamp, their silhouettes elongating on the walls like dueling monsters. They puffed up, hissed, and circled each other in a dance that looked more dramatic under flickering gaslight. Eventually one cat decided it had better things to do and trotted off, leaving the other to claim victory with a triumphant howl that woke 3 households. While dogs travelled in groups, cats were solitary operators. They had routes, landmarks, and hiding places known only to them. They visited open windows, napped on warm carriage seats, perched atop chimneys, raided fish stalls, and made mental maps of every garden where leftover bones might appear. Their intelligence was impressive, their boldness astonishing, and their ability to appear exactly where they shouldn't be was practically supernatural. Together, the stray dogs and cats formed a vibrant nighttime ecosystem. Dogs controlled the ground-level chaos. Cats dominated the upper structures. Sometimes their territories overlapped, leading to brief standoffs. Dogs barking at cats perched smugly on high ledges, cats flicking tails as if to say, "You can't get me and you know it." These interactions were nightly entertainment for anyone awake enough to watch. And then there were the other animals quietly participating in this after-hours wildlife parade. Rats scurried in enormous numbers, thriving on waste and darting between crates with unsettling speed. Horses in stables stomped and snorted, unsettled by nighttime noises. Street pigeons, yes, even at night, cooed irritably when something disturbed their rest. Occasionally goats, pigs, or chickens escaped their pens and wandered the street until retrieved in the morning like lost children. The sounds of the Victorian night animal kingdom, barks, yelps, growls, hisses, screeches, flapping wings, soft paws and skittering claws, created an eerie, ever-changing chorus. It was no wonder that many Victorians believed the night was haunted. The animals were doing an excellent job providing the special effects. In truth, the nocturnal animals weren't ghostly at all. They were simply taking advantage of a city that was dark, scattered with food, full of hiding places, and governed by creatures who slept with their doors locked. The Victorian night belonged as much to the animals as it did to the people, if not more. If the Victorian night had an unsung hero, it was the man armed with a shovel, a bucket, and the kind of courage that should earn a medal made of solid gold. While most citizens tucked themselves into bed, blissfully unaware of what horrors lurked beneath their feet, another workforce emerged. One that operated in darkness, stench, and conditions so miserable they make modern complaints about working late sound adorable. These were the night soil men, sewer workers, street sweepers, and other clean-up crews whose thankless nocturnal labour kept the city from collapsing into a smelly heap of its own making. Let's begin with the night soil men, a group that deserves far more respect than history usually gives them. Their job description was simple: collect, transport and dispose of human waste, their working environment, the dead of night. Their protective gear, hope and a sturdy stomach. While wealthy households occasionally had indoor plumbing, most Victorian homes relied on privies, outhouses, cesspits, or simple holes that needed to be emptied regularly. But nobody wanted to witness that process, much less smell it. So the night soil men came when darkness offered anonymity, and when residents were too asleep to question who was sloshing a bucket outside their window. Operating quietly as one can while hauling a barrel of sewage, these workers navigated narrow alleys and back courtyards, removing waste from cesspits and carting it away in wagons that definitely did not pass modern health inspections. The smell followed them like an unwanted shadow. They were paid well for the era, but not well enough, and certainly not enough for the risk. Cesspits sometimes collapsed. Toxic fumes in underground sewers caused fainting or worse. Rats were frequent co-workers. Disease lurked everywhere. And still, night after night, these men worked with grim determination, knowing that if they didn't show up, the city would quite literally overflow. Then there were the sewer workers, the subterranean soldiers of the night. Victorian sewers were a labyrinth of tunnels, some newly engineered marvels under cities like London, others medieval mysteries that had been repurposed without proper mapping. Navigating them required experience, lanterns, and nerves of steel. Sewer crews descended several feet underground, wading through water, muck, and the occasional unidentifiable blob that absolutely did not belong in polite society. They repaired drains, cleared blockages, redirected flows, and occasionally rescued objects that residents dropped down drains and later regretted losing. Their nights were humid, dim, and claustrophobic, lit by lanterns whose flickering made the tunnels look like entryways into the underworld. Above ground, another essential crew got to work, the street sweepers. These men were tasked with restoring the streets from chaotic, trash-laden obstacle courses back into something resembling civilization by morning. After all, Victorian roads collected everything: potato peels, fishbone piles, broken mahon pottery, cabbage leaves, discarded pamphlets, wagon debris, and enough mud to construct a small village. Add in the contributions of stray animals, the occasional spilled delivery cart, and the ever-present mixture of dust and refuse, and you had a city that needed serious help before shopkeepers opened their doors. Street sweepers moved methodically, pushing wide brooms, scraping shovels, and carrying baskets for collecting waste. They cleared gutters, swept refuse into piles, and carted them away in wheelbarrows, often while humming tunes or muttering to themselves about the general state of humanity. They worked through fog, drizzle, and freezing temperatures, their hands stiff and their boots perpetually caked with grime. Despite the dirty nature of the job, sweepers held a peculiar pride. They could look upon a freshly cleaned street as the product of their labour, a momentary victory against the unending tide of urban filth. And while citizens rarely thanked them, they certainly noticed when sweepers missed a spot. Nothing delights a Victorian busybody more than pointing out a neglected gutter. Another nighttime sanitation force consisted of rubbish collectors, though rubbish was a generous term. These workers hauled away piles of household trash left at curbs or alleys, sorting through materials that could be burned, reused, or sold. Victorian recycling wasn't environmental, it was economic necessity. Old cloth became rag paper, bones were rendered or repurposed, metal scraps were melted down, and broken pottery was, well, still broken, but someone might want it. These collectors navigated the streets with carts that rattled loudly, causing light sleepers to mutter curses at 3 a.m. Yet among all these nighttime labourers, none faced stranger hazards than the midnight sewer flushers in certain cities. When sewer lines became clogged, workers manually released water surges to force debris along. This required perfect timing and great teamwork, or else someone was liable to be unpleasantly swept into the next district. Few jobs combined hydrodynamics with raw panic quite like this one. The city's sanitation system at night was not just about cleaning, it was about preventing catastrophe. Without these nocturnal crews, waste would accumulate, disease would spread, and the morning streets would resemble something between a battlefield and a compost heap. Their work was invisible by design. They finished before dawn so that when residents awoke, they could pretend the streets had always been that tidy. No one wanted to imagine the army of exhausted men who had spent the night pushing back the tide of urban squalor. And yet, these workers formed their own tight-knit community. They shared tips on which alleys were the worst, advice for avoiding sewer gas pockets, warnings about loose paving slabs, and gossip passed down from lamplighters and night watchmen. They moved like quiet guardians, fighting nightly battles against entropy itself. Their labour took place far from glamour, far from recognition, but without them, Victorian life would have collapsed. The city's public sanitation crews were the unsung backbone of the night. They endured filth, fatigue, and dangers no polite society acknowledged, all to ensure that when the sun rose, the Victorian world looked, smelled, and functioned far better than it had any right to. For most of the night, Victorian streets belonged to labourers, drunks, stray animals, and brave souls who ventured out for work or necessity. But then came the moment when an entirely different kind of crowd spilled into the night. A dazzling wave of satin, silk, polished boots, jewelled hairpieces, and perfume strong enough to stun a horse. When the theatres let out, the streets transformed instantly. It was as if someone had thrown open the doors of a jewellery box and poured its contents directly onto the pavement. The Victorian theatre crowd was a spectacle unto itself. Opera houses, playhouses, and music halls were bright islands of culture in the otherwise dim world of the nighttime city. Inside, chandeliers glittered, orchestras hummed, and velvet seats cushioned audiences who had spent the day pretending to be respectable and were now ready to be emotionally devastated by tragic arias or entertained by slapstick farce. But once the final note echoed, the curtain fell and the applause faded, this elegant congregation funneled themselves through the doors and into a street that was decidedly less glamorous. The first thing anyone noticed was the contrast. These were people dressed in their finest, men in crisp black evening coats, gleaming shirt studs, and perfectly knotted cravats. Women in elaborate gowns whose layers took several servants to assemble, with shawls draped delicately and gloves that extended nearly to their elbows. Hair was styled, jewellery sparkled, perfume lingered. This was society at its most visually theatrical, an extension of the performance they had just watched. And then they stepped onto the pavement. The same pavement that had, moments earlier, played host to stray dogs chasing each other, coal ash drifting down like urban-born snow, and workers hauling crates past grimy alleyways. The ground was uneven, often muddy, and filled with mysterious puddles that no one, absolutely no one, wanted to investigate closely. But this did not stop the theatre crowd, who navigated the street with a combination of determination, confidence, and the careful footwork of people who refused to let their garments make contact with anything unsavoury. Carriages lined up outside the theatres in clusters, creating what can only be described as a Victorian traffic jam, horses snorting, drivers shouting, wheels creaking, and impatient passengers craning their necks to see if that was their cab finally arriving. The process of matching wealthy theatre-goers with their carriages required a level of coordination usually reserved for military operations. Drivers held lanterns, servants raised umbrellas, and footmen called out names with dramatic flair. "Carriage for Lady Pembury!" "Cab for Sir Alden!" "Coach for the McAllister party!" Each announcement was met with a flurry of movement, men offering arms to women, women lifting their skirts slightly to avoid disaster, hats being tipped left and right in a dance of politeness. The Victorians loved ceremony, and nowhere was this clearer than in the refined chaos of post-theatre exits. Those who did not hire carriages walked, or attempted to. Groups strolled along the street arm in arm, discussing the show. The opera critics of the evening emerged proudly, analysing performances with the authority of people who attended one show a month but talked as if they managed the orchestra themselves. Couples chatted softly, comparing favourite moments or whispering in tones far too intimate for the ears of passing strangers. And yet, even amid this refinement, the street refused to behave. A sudden gust of wind would send dust swirling into immaculate hair. A passing cart might splash water, or worse, onto the hem of a silk gown. A stray cat might dart between ankles, nearly causing a gentleman to lose his balance and dignity simultaneously. The street had no interest in matching the crowd's elegance. It remained stubbornly, unapologetically Victorian. Street vendors saw opportunity. As soon as the doors opened, sellers appeared like actors entering stage left, offering roasted nuts, warm pastries, sheet music, flowers, cheap jewellery, or opera glasses, slightly used but very refined. Some vendors mimicked the accents of the aristocracy so poorly that even the dogs looked offended, but business was brisk nonetheless. What respectable lady didn't want a small bouquet? What gentleman didn't enjoy a quick bite on the way home before the roast dinner awaiting him? And then came the night gawkers, working-class locals who lingered near theatres purely to admire the spectacle of wealth exiting the building, like rare birds from an exotic aviary. Children stared at the shimmering fabrics. Young women compared gowns to what was displayed in shop windows, imagining owning something so delicate one day. Men watched the polished carriages roll past, admiring craftsmanship they could never afford. For them, the theatre exit was a free show, the closest they might come to witnessing high society in motion. Police officers and watchmen, posted nearby to maintain order, tried their best to keep carriages moving and pedestrians safe. They waved lanterns, gestured at drivers, and intervened when crowds grew too dense. But coordinating this amount of elegance in such a limited space was like herding cats who believed themselves superior to herders. Despite all this bustle, there was an air of magic to the scene. The theatre crowd sparkled, literally and figuratively, illuminating the street with their presence. For a few minutes each night, the city felt transformed, elevated, humming with sophistication. The opera lights dimmed behind them, but the glamour lingered, spreading out from the theatre doors like ripples. And then, just as quickly as it began, the moment ended. Carriages clipped away, couples disappeared into side streets, groups dispersed. Vendors packed up their goods. The street quieted once more, returning to its usual mix of shadows, stray animals, and night workers. But for that brief window of time, Victorian nighttime wasn't just gritty or dangerous, it was dazzling. It was proof that even the darkest city streets could shine for a moment, illuminated not by gas lamps, but by people dressed as though their feet never touched grime at all. In the Victorian night, once the taverns roared, theatres glittered, watchmen hollered the time, and the stray dogs held their committee meetings, another group emerged, one powered not by wages or schedules, but by opportunity. These were the nighttime vendors, entrepreneurs of the shadows, hustlers of the lamplit hours who understood a simple truth about human nature. People spend money differently after dark, faster, looser, with noticeably less thinking involved. Daytime vendors sold practicality, nighttime vendors sold impulse, and business was good. Their presence transformed certain streets into miniature after-dark marketplaces, less organised than daytime markets, but more exciting. This was commerce with personality, unpredictable, lively, sometimes shady, occasionally delicious, frequently questionable, and always entertaining. Let's begin with the most beloved of them, the toffee sellers. These men and women pushed carts or carried trays hung around their necks, offering lumps of sticky, sweet joy that glistened under gas lamps like amber treasure. Their toffee was often homemade, boiled in small pots hours earlier, flavoured with treacle, butter or peppermint, and broken into chunks that had a 50% chance of being delicious and a 50% chance of removing a loose tooth. Children adored them. Adults adored them in secret. And the vendors themselves understood the power of a well-timed shout. Toffee! Warm toffee, ladies and gents, finest in the district. It didn't matter if every vendor said that. Victorians weren't choosing quality. They were choosing proximity and enthusiasm. And with chilly nighttime air settling in, warm toffee wasn't just a treat, it was a minor miracle. Next came the torch sellers, arguably the most practical nighttime vendors, especially on foggy evenings when gaslight turned into decorative glowing blobs instead of illumination. These sellers carried bundles of wax torches, dipped reeds, or small oil lamps with tin reflectors. If you were caught outside with poor visibility, a torch seller appeared like a guardian angel offering fire for a few pennies, and they knew their market well. They lingered near theatre exits. Don't stumble home in darkness, sir. Outside taverns where drunks emerged blinking like newly hatched chicks, and at major crossroads where shadows swallowed entire streets. Torch sellers often saved people from sprained ankles, wrong turns, or embarrassing run-ins with lampposts. But torch sellers weren't the only ones lighting up the night. There were also musicians, the soundtrack providers of the Victorian street. Some played violins with surprising skill. Others played hand organs that wheezed out cheerful tunes, whether the machine wanted to or not. Many carried penny whistles, drums, or improvised instruments made from boxes, spoons, and levels of optimism bordering on delusion. Their music wasn't always good, but it was always there, drifting through the night like an unofficial score to the evening's activities. People tossed coins, applauded, danced, complained, or pretended not to hear. But musicians made the street feel alive, giving sound to places that might otherwise feel desolate. Children danced, couples lingered, drunks sang along terribly. And for those brief moments the night felt like a carnival. Of course, where there was music, there were also street performers, fire jugglers, acrobats, living statue imitators, an ancient tradition apparently, and storytellers who recited sensational tales with exaggerated flair. These performers gathered loose crowds, hoping for a few scattered coins from spectators who would never see them again. Their routines were loud, frantic, and vibrant, especially since a poorly timed act could attract the attention of police, who disapproved of obstructed pathways, gatherings, and any entertainment that didn't pay taxes. Then came the hustlers, the street-smart schemers who treated nighttime commerce like a sport. They sold trinkets of dubious value, lucky charms guaranteed to protect against illness, pocket combs, cheap jewellery, imported ribbons likely made 3 blocks away, and miracle tonics brewed from recipes best left unexplained. Hustlers were fearless salesmen. They targeted people leaving taverns, couples feeling romantic, gentlemen eager to impress, or anyone displaying the slightest interest in anything whatsoever. Their pitch was always dramatic. This ribbon, finest silk from Paris. Paris Street, that is. This tonic cures headaches, heartbreak, and possibly death itself. This charm protected 3 sailors, none of whom are ghosts now. Oh. I promise. And because nighttime made people impulsive, coin exchanged hands more often than logic recommended. There were also flower girls, young vendors carrying baskets of freshly cut flowers, roses, violets, primroses, whatever could be gathered cheaply earlier Cat's Day. Their calls were soft, sweet attempts to charm passers-by. Flowers for your lady, sir. A penny for a posy. Their trade depended heavily on sentiment and guilt. Gentlemen often bought flowers to soften awkward comments made during the show or to appear romantic. Others purchased out of pity. Some bought simply because saying no to a child holding violets under a gas lamp felt morally corrupt. Then there were the food hawkers working the late shift. Men selling steamed puddings from tin boilers, women offering slices of hot pie from portable ovens, and vendors selling custard cups, sugared apples, or spiced buns. Their goods were delicious, comforting, and deeply questionable in terms of origin, temperature, or age. But the night lowered standards. Hunger won battles that hygiene couldn't. All these nighttime vendors understood something crucial. The city after dark was full of customers who were cold, tipsy, hurried, sentimental, or bored. Ideal conditions for spontaneous spending. And vendors made the most of it, popping up wherever gaps existed, calling out to the darkness, weaving between crowds and bringing colour to streets that would otherwise be nothing but fog and shadows. The Victorian night hosted many characters, but these vendors gave it warmth, noise, and personality. They kept the streets lively, kept the economy churning, and proved that even at midnight London, Manchester, Edinburgh, and every other bustling Victorian city was very much awake. If you thought navigating Victorian streets on foot at night was risky, try doing it while sitting inside a moving wooden box pulled by an animal with a bedtime. Night transportation in Victorian cities was less a convenience and more an act of faith. Faith that the horse wouldn't bolt, faith that the driver wouldn't doze off, and faith that you wouldn't end the journey inside a gutter, a lamppost, or someone's pastry cart. Let's begin with the nightcab, the most iconic nocturnal chariot of the Victorian era. These horse-drawn vehicles weren't elegant carriages gliding majestically through the streets. They were clattering, bouncing contraptions driven by men who had been awake too long and paid too little. The typical nightcab driver was a hardened figure, bleary-eyed, wrapped in layers of worn coats, and possessing a voice that could cut through fog and cold like a knife. You hailed a cab by waving, shouting, stepping into the street, or simply standing somewhere inconvenient until a driver noticed you. Drivers had a sixth sense for potential fares, especially the slightly drunk, the desperate, the hopelessly lost, or the couples whispering urgently under a gas lamp. Unspoken rule: if a person looked like they urgently needed to be anywhere but here, the cab would appear. Once a cab picked you up, you entered a world of Victorian night cab etiquette, which was half social courtesy, half survival strategy. First, you didn't slam the door, because Victorian cab doors were fragile things, prone to rattling off their hinges at the slightest insult. Second, you didn't insult the horse. Drivers took that personally. Third, you didn't ask the driver to hurry unless you were prepared to tip like royalty, because hurry translated to drive faster than physics recommends. Inside the cab, the experience was intimate and alarming. The small cabin swayed like a boat in choppy water, bumping over cobblestones, rattling against loose metal fittings, and creaking ominously with every dip in the road. If the horse stumbled, a common occurrence, passengers lurched forward, which Victorian fashion thankfully cushioned by several layers of padding and corsetry. Night drivers relied heavily on instinct and memory, because visibility was worse than useless. Gas lamps cast wobbly islands of light, moonlight faded behind industrial haze, and fog created the sensation of travelling through a bowl of warm porridge. Drivers often navigated by counting their horses' steps, recognising the echo off nearby buildings, or simply trusting the horse to remember the route better than they could. And horses? They were the unsung navigational geniuses of the night. Many drays, hansoms and cabs were guided not by their drivers, but by animals who recognised street smells, gradients and habitual paths. A sober horse paired with a sleepy driver was often the safest combination. The reverse was much more concerning. Then there were the omnibuses, large horse-drawn buses that operated late into the night on main routes. These were the Victorian equivalent of last call public transport, crowded, bumpy and full of passengers who regretted every life choice that led them onto the vehicle. Boarding required timing and agility, because omnibuses rarely stopped fully. They slowed down just enough for people to jump on or off with the grace of startled goats. Inside, benches ran lengthwise, forcing passengers to sit shoulder to shoulder with perfect strangers. In daytime, this was awkward. At night, it was a sociological experiment. You might find yourself squeezed between a fishmonger carrying tomorrow's stock, a tired maid clutching her meagre wages, and a gentleman doing his very best to pretend he wasn't on public transport at all. Every jolt sent the entire row swaying in unison like a human metronome. Night omnibuses had a reputation for being unpredictable. Some skipped stops, some arrived early, some arrived hours late after the horses decided to pause for an unsanctioned snack. Missing your stop was a real danger. Omnibuses didn't offer refunds, sympathy, or second chances. If you realised too late that your destination was fading behind you, your only solution was to yell, leap, or resign yourself to a very long walk back. The fare rules were posted inside the omnibus, though reading them at night required squinting at tiny print under a flickering lamp, often while the vehicle lurched vigorously. Fares were supposed to be fixed, but unscrupulous conductors occasionally charged extra to anyone who looked confused, foreign, intoxicated, or polite. Payment was made directly to the conductor, who rang a bell to signal the driver, unless the bell was broken, as many were, in which case he thumped the roof. Beyond cabs and omnibuses were the more specialised late-night vehicles. Milk carts heading into the city before dawn, goods wagons travelling solely through the night to avoid daytime crowds, private hired carriages transporting the wealthy from theatre to club to home. These vehicles all shared one trait. None of them wanted to collide with one another. But Victorian roads were nothing if not democratic. Horses wandered, drivers shouted, wheels skidded. It was a nightly ballet of almost accidents. One of the greatest thrills and terrors of Victorian night transportation was the subtle suspicion that your driver might be drifting off. Many worked 12 to 16-hour days. Some drank, some simply reached the end of their endurance. Passengers watched their driver's silhouette anxiously, praying the rain stayed steady and the vehicle didn't veer into a wall. "Please stay awake" might not have been spoken aloud, but it echoed through every nervous heartbeat. And yet, despite the dangers, night transportation was indispensable. Without it, theatres couldn't empty their audiences, taverns wouldn't stay open late, workers couldn't get home, and the city's nighttime economy would grind to a halt. Cabs and omnibuses were the arteries of the Victorian night, messy, unreliable, noisy arteries, but crucial nonetheless. In their creaking, clattering way, these vehicles stitched together a city that never truly slept. They carried the weary, the wealthy, the workers, and the wanderers through streets where every shadow hid a story. Victorian nights were not only a stage for cab drivers, theatre crowds, watchmen, and vendors. They were also a silent battlefield where thousands of the city's poorest residents fought a nightly war against cold, hunger, exhaustion, and hopelessness. While wealthier Victorians returned to warm parlours and soft feather beds, a vast population slept wherever the city allowed them to collapse. Doorsteps, alleys, stairwells, abandoned carts, bridges, empty markets, and every shadowed crevice overlooked by those hurrying home. Homelessness in the Victorian era was widespread, brutal, and deeply stigmatised. It was the result of unemployment, illness, injury, orphanhood, low wages, or simply being born into families whose economic margins were so thin that one mistake or one unlucky winter pushed them onto the streets. The city did not have shelters. It had workhouses, institutions so feared that even the starving avoided them. They offered food and a bed, yes, but only in exchange for your freedom, your dignity, your family's separation, and labour that broke people faster than it helped them. And so many slept rough instead, choosing the uncertainty of the streets over the guaranteed misery of the workhouse. As night fell, the homeless population dispersed and sought their sleeping spots like players in a tragic and unwinnable game of musical chairs, except the music was horse traffic, the chairs were wet cobblestones, and the prize was simply surviving until morning. Their options were few and rarely safe. One of the most common resting places was doorways, recessed spaces at the entrances of shops, taverns, warehouses, and townhouses. The overhanging roofs sheltered them from rain. The stone steps offered a surface relatively cleaner than the street. A thick coat, if one was lucky enough to have one, became both mattress and blanket. People curled themselves into tight shapes, using walls as backrests, knees tucked beneath their chins, faces hidden in their sleeves. Shop owners hated it. Constables sometimes shooed them away. But for the homeless, doorways were prime real estate, the difference between shivering into the early hours and making it through the night. Others took to alleys, the narrow arteries of the Victorian city where darkness thickened and curious eyes dared not wander. Alleys offered invisibility, which was a blessing and a curse. A person could sleep undisturbed, but also unnoticed if danger found them. Rats scuttled, stray animals prowled, drunks stumbled through without looking. Criminals occasionally claimed these spaces as their own, but for many the alley's embrace, cold, damp and unforgiving, was the best they had. In warmer months, some slept in courtyards nestled behind tenements or workshops, where the air was stale but the ground was at least flat. Others found refuge behind market stalls after the vendors cleared out at dusk. A vegetable cart became a windbreak. A fishmonger's table became a makeshift roof. The lingering smells were foul but familiar. The markets were quiet at night, offering rare pockets of stillness in a city that never fully slept. An especially desperate group slept in parks or green spaces, though Victorian parks were hardly the manicured oases we imagine today. Trees offered some protection, benches offered a place to lay down, and underbrush provided cover. But parks were patrolled by night watchmen who were quick to rouse sleepers, sometimes gently, sometimes not, under the belief that public greenery should be reserved for daytime respectability, not nighttime survival. By winter, the options narrowed to the terrifyingly few. People huddled near warm air vents, steam pipes, and even stable walls, hoping to absorb a little heat. They pressed themselves against bakery chimneys that radiated warmth long after ovens cooled. Some lingered in stairwells or beneath bridges, anywhere the wind couldn't bite them to the bone. Clothing was often their only barrier against the cold. Coats were patched with scraps of cloth, newspapers, or straw. Gloves were mismatched or non-existent. Boots might have holes the size of a coin or be wrapped in rags. A blanket was a luxury beyond imagining. Some slept upright because lying down meant losing body heat. Others shared space, clustering close, not out of companionship but survival. And then there were the pavement sleepers, perhaps the most haunting image of Victorian urban poverty. These individuals collapsed wherever exhaustion overcame them. Curbs, street corners, stairways, even beneath lamplights. Passers-by stepped over them, around them, or past them, occasionally muttering about public nuisances, but rarely considering the human story beneath the ragged clothing. Victorian newspapers often described these sleepers with a mixture of pity and moral judgment. Drunkards, they said, idlers, the undeserving poor. But the truth was starker. Many were simply exhausted workers who couldn't afford rent. Others were widows, orphans, or elderly labourers discarded by the workforce. They slept rough because their wages, or lack of them, gave them no alternatives. And yet, despite their invisibility in polite society, the homeless formed their own nighttime networks. They shared information, which alleys were safest, where soup kitchens sometimes handed out leftovers, which constables were sympathetic, which shopkeepers chased them with brooms. They protected one another when they could. Older homeless men sometimes kept an eye on runaway teens. Women banded together for safety. People shared scraps of food, news, warmth, warnings. Nighttime amplified the cruelty of poverty. While wealthier residents hurried past, clutching shawls and stepping daintily to avoid puddles, the homeless curled into the shadows, unseen unless someone chose to look, unheard unless they made noise, unacknowledged unless they interfered with the business of the respectable. Victorian cities loved to present themselves as engines of progress, shimmering with new railways, gaslights, industry, fashion, and theatre. But the nighttime streets told a different truth. Progress had a price, and thousands paid it by sleeping outside, in the cold, on stone, with nothing but hope and ragged coats between themselves and the elements. They were the silent foundation of the city's darker reality, stepping stones, quite literally, for those who refused to see them. While large parts of the Victorian city belonged to workers, vendors, strays, and the invisible poor once the sun went down, there existed another category of nighttime wanderer, one with a very different motivation. These were the middle-class night strollers, respectable men and women who stepped outside after dark for a breath of fresh air, a hint of romance, or a quiet escape from the endless social obligations of the daylight hours. They were not out to work, fight, sing drunkenly, or steal anything. They were simply strolling. But even something as wholesome as a nighttime walk carried layers of etiquette, caution, and whispered judgment. For the Victorian middle class, nighttime strolling was an activity, a ritual and a risk, all tied together by the need to maintain an image of respectability. A man could walk alone without much comment, but a woman, especially an unaccompanied one, was another matter entirely. Even married women felt social pressure to keep late-night outings discreet. Respectability was fragile, and the line between taking a lovely evening walk and what on earth was she doing out there was thinner than the hem of a well-worn petticoat. Couples walking together had more leeway. A husband escorting his wife or a chaperoned pair of courting individuals could legitimately claim they were simply getting some air after dinner. Strolling after a heavy Victorian meal, which often included generous portions of meat, potatoes, pastry, and richer-than-wise puddings, was practically a medical recommendation. Doctors encouraged light movement to aid digestion, though many Victorians secretly suspected that doctors just liked a good walk themselves. These couples appeared like ghosts drifting under gas lamps, silhouettes arm in arm, voices low and murmuring, as if the night were listening for secrets. The dim glow cast just enough light to see where one's boots were going, but not enough to dispel the sense that the street was a stage, and every passerby an audience member taking mental notes. A woman might lift the edge of her dress delicately to avoid puddles, while her partner offered an arm with the formality of a man performing an intricate dance step taught at finishing school. Every gesture was careful, rehearsed, and very proper. Even so, strolling at night came with hazards, not the dramatic sort, footpads or drunken brawls. Those belonged largely to poorer districts or darker alleys and were avoided by the middle class at all costs. No, the middle-class stroller feared something far more socially fatal than danger, being seen and misinterpreted. Reputation was everything. A well-to-do couple spotted walking too late in the evening might become the subject of eyebrow-raising breakfast gossip. A woman passing by a tavern at night, even at a distance, risked being whispered about by the neighbours who preferred speculation to silence. And heaven forbid she made eye contact with a constable. Someone might assume she was seeking help, or worse, that she was behaving curiously. Thus, the middle-class stroll was not so much a carefree wander as a carefully curated performance of refinement conducted under questionable lighting. People walked slowly, gracefully, with a posture that said, "I belong here, and I am definitely not up to anything scandalous." Couples avoided eye contact with strangers. They crossed the street to dodge noisy groups. They stepped aside politely for cab passengers, stray dogs, or musicians. They avoided touching each other too affectionately. Middle-class love was supposed to be subtle, not displayed under gas lamps where Mrs. Jameson from number 4 might be lurking behind her curtains. But beneath the stiff etiquette, there was genuine romance. The nighttime stroll was one of the few acceptable ways for couples to speak privately, without being overheard by an entire living room full of relatives. Young couples about to be engaged treasured these walks like precious slivers of freedom. Soft conversation, whispered jokes, hopeful glances, hands brushing accidentally, all of it felt more magical under the uncertain glow of the lamps. Even long-married couples found themselves sharing quiet moments, breathing in the cool night air, enjoying each other's company free from household noise and children demanding attention. Families also walked together, parents with teenage children, siblings sharing an outing, widows accompanied by trustworthy friends. These strolls were seen as virtuous, moral, even healthy. Nothing soothed the nerves after a long day like a peaceful walk through a well-lit avenue lined with respectable townhouses. It was a way to unwind without admitting one needed to unwind, a subtle difference absolutely essential to Victorian sensibilities. But despite the charm, the night stroller had to be mindful of curfew culture, especially in more conservative neighbourhoods. While there were no official citywide curfews for the middle class, social expectations acted as one. The respectable hour to return home varied by district, but one rule was universal. Being out too late made people talk. A couple strolling past 10 o'clock risked whispers. After 11, assumptions began to form. After midnight, even the most innocent walk became fodder for scandal. So these walks usually ended early. As the night deepened, the middle-class strollers returned home, boots brushing against doorsteps, keys turning quietly in locks, lamps being extinguished inside warmly lit parlours. The streets, once glowing with a mild elegance, faded back into the murkier domain of watchmen, stray animals, late workers, and other creatures of the darker hour. If daytime Victorian society ran on formality, nighttime ran on fear of judgment, and yet, paradoxically, on a desire for fleeting freedom. For a few brief moments under the gas lamps, middle-class citizens stepped outside their structured worlds and breathed in the cool air, daring to enjoy the city in a way that felt both rebellious and refined. And then they retreated before anyone had time to accuse them of mischief, or worse, improper strolling. Victorian nights were unpredictable enough without the weather joining the party. Darkness alone could turn a simple walk into a tense adventure, but add rain, wind, sleet, or the occasional biblical thunderclap, and suddenly the streets transformed from mildly hazardous to "I hope my will is updated" dangerous. Weather didn't politely wait until morning. It arrived when it pleased, often without warning, sweeping through the city with mood swings so dramatic it could have been a supporting character in a melodrama at the local theatre. Rain was the most frequent nighttime visitor, and it had a special talent for turning cobblestones into a treacherous skating rink. Victorian streets weren't smooth, modern asphalt. They were uneven, slick, and full of gaps that collected puddles deep enough to hide small fish. Rain pooled in these irregular crevices, masking every dip, crack, and ankle trap beneath a reflective layer that looked charming from indoors and devastating from the street. One poorly placed step could send a person sliding, wobbling, or performing an improvised dance routine worthy of applause, if anyone had been foolish enough to be outside watching. Water also mixed beautifully with the city's ever-present layers of ash, mud, horse manure, and food waste, creating puddles of questionable origin that pedestrians avoided with the same urgency as unexploded ordnance. The brave carried umbrellas, flimsy contraptions made of oilcloth and wood that turned inside out at the slightest provocation. The truly prepared wrapped their boots with makeshift rain guards. And the unlucky? They learned that a nighttime Victorian downpour could soak a person so thoroughly that even their personality felt wet. Wind added its own flair, reshaping narrow streets into full-fledged wind tunnels. Victorian architecture, with its tall row houses and cramped alleys, created perfect channels for gusts to gather speed and launch themselves through the night like invisible battering rams. Hats flew, shawls flapped, coats ballooned. Anyone under 5'5" had to lean at an angle to remain standing. Gas lamps flickered wildly, casting frantic shadows that made every trash pile look like a lurking intruder. Some corners were famous for their wind. Locals learned to brace themselves, clutch their skirts, or lower their heads like determined mountain climbers. Passing one of these notorious intersections was an exercise in endurance. If you managed it without losing an item of clothing, your dignity, or a personal belief in the stability of nature, you were considered lucky. On particularly blustery nights, the wind whistled between chimney pots, turning entire streets into eerie, low-pitched woodwind sections from the orchestra of doom. Then there were winter nights, when cold temperatures transformed the city into an enormous, poorly designed ice trap. Frost crept across rooftops, railings, and stones. Breath turned to mist. Water left over from the day's rainfall froze into thin, deceptive sheets that made walking feel like navigating a floor coated entirely in soap. People slid, horses slipped, wagons skidded. Falling on the ice was so common that Victorians developed a near-professional technique of controlled collapsing, a desperate attempt to fall in a way that preserved both bones and modesty. Icicles also formed, hanging from eaves like pretty lethal daggers waiting for an unsuspecting passerby to tempt gravity. Snow, though beautiful, never fell politely. It blanketed streets unevenly, hiding hazards. It turned into slush by midnight, then froze again, becoming a gritty, solid block by morning, nature's version of pick your misfortune. But the most dramatic night weather of all, thunderstorms. Victorian thunderstorms didn't just arrive, they announced themselves with the theatricality of a diva entering the stage. First came the gust of wind, then the sudden stillness, then the deep earth-rattling growl across the sky. Lightning illuminated rooftops and chimneys in stark flashes, revealing for one instant every crooked railing, leaning chimney, startled cat and wide-eyed pedestrian before plunging them back into darkness. Thunder hammered against walls, shaking windows and waking babies, adults, pets, and occasionally even a nightcab driver who had fallen asleep mid-route. Churches rang not because anyone pulled the bells, but because thunder vibrated through the metal. Rain hammered rooftops, turning gutters into miniature waterfalls. Streets became rivers, and crossing them required the balance of a tightrope walker combined with the optimism of someone who hadn't yet accepted their fate. Victorians reacted to thunderstorms with a mixture of awe, panic, and religious dread. Many believed lightning was divine judgment, or at least divine irritation. People huddled in doorways, crossed themselves, prayed, or sprinted home through sheets of rain while cursing their life choices. Horses balked and reared, adding chaos to an already dramatic scene. Gas lamps sputtered, windows rattled, chimneys groaned, and strangers exchanged brief, knowing glances that said, "We are all absolutely going to regret being outside right now." But thunderstorms weren't just terrifying, they were transformative. The sharp bursts of light revealed the city in fleeting snapshots, like ink drawings illuminated by celestial fire. The darkness deepened after each flash. Shadows grew long, moving like living things. For those watching from safe windows, the storm was a magnificent show. For those caught in it, the experience was best described as wet, frightening, and deeply personal. Even the fog reacted to weather. Rain sometimes dispersed it, clearing visibility. Other times it thickened into a heavy drifting blanket that swallowed sound and blurred outlines. Fog combined with wind could make entire streets vanish from sight, forcing pedestrians to feel their way along walls like blind explorers. And if thunder rumbled through fog, the whole city felt eerily muffled, as if wrapped in a damp, vibrating cocoon. Weather, more than anything, shaped the Victorian nighttime experience. It dictated who ventured out, how people moved, what dangers lurked, and what stories were told over breakfast the next morning. Rain made the streets slick, wind turned corners into obstacles, ice demanded caution. Thunder reminded everyone that nature had far more power than any gas lamp. Victorian nights had personality, but when the weather joined in, they had drama. There was nothing quite like the moment Victorian night began loosening its grip on the city. It didn't happen suddenly, there was no dramatic curtain lift, no sudden flood of brightness. Instead, the night retreated the way a reluctant guest leaves a party, slowly shuffling toward the exit while muttering that it really should be going, but still lingering long enough to cause one last disruption. Sunrise in the Victorian city was a quiet negotiation between darkness and daylight. And during that in-between hour, the streets flickered through two worlds at once. The very first sign wasn't light at all, it was smell. Specifically, the warm, yeasty perfume of early morning bakeries sparking their first fires. Before even a hint of blue touched the sky, bakery chimneys belched out gentle streams of smoke that curled upward like sleepy sighs. For night workers and stragglers, this smell was a kind of salvation, proof that the night had an ending, that warmth existed, and that civilization was creeping back whether the city was ready or not. The bakers themselves were deep into their morning shift, kneading dough, feeding ovens, and muttering to themselves as they shaped loaves with swift, practiced hands. The glow from their hearth spilled onto the street in amber strokes, creating little pockets of comfort that contrasted sharply with the fading hush of the night. And as the warmth expanded, so did the sense of renewal. Morning's coming and the world is resetting. The next sign came from above, the lamplighters' return. Only a few hours earlier, these men had marched through the city lighting each gas lamp one by one in their twilight parade. But at dawn, the procession reversed. With long poles in hand, they extinguished the lamps with swift flicks, tapping the glass heads gently as if telling them, "Good job, now go back to sleep." Street by street, lamp by lamp, they unravelled the city's nighttime glow. The remaining lamps flickered weakly, their flames shrinking like embarrassed party guests caught staying too late. Watching the lamplighters at dawn was a strange experience. It made the night feel like a temporary stage set, beautiful, eerie, chaotic, being carefully dismantled piece by piece until the city's daytime facade was ready again. Their movements were calm, practiced, almost ritualistic, and as each lamp winked out, the sky took on a deeper hue, preparing its first quiet greeting. Meanwhile, the street sweepers, Those nocturnal custodians of grit and grime were finishing the last of their battles. They dragged brooms stiff with use. They shoveled refuse into carts that creaked under the weight. They cleared gutters, brushed away puddles, and swept up debris from the previous evening's adventures. Broken toffee wrappers, cigar ends, wilted flowers from theatre-goers' gums, puddles disturbed by bee dogs, and the occasional lost glove or mysterious shoe. By sunrise, the sweepers were both exhausted and triumphant, having wrestled the city's accumulated chaos into something resembling dignity. Nearby, the milkmen began their early trot into the city, pushing carts or leading horses that jingled softly with metal canisters. They arrived from the outskirts where dairies spread across green fields, bringing fresh milk long before most city residents stirred. They worked methodically, placing bottles or ladling milk into pots left by doorsteps. Their presence signalled the official start of morning proper. If you heard a milk cart's wheels rattling faintly in the distance, you knew the sun wasn't far behind. And all around, the human world shifted. The night workers, bakers, printers, sweepers, coal deliverers, watchmen, retreated toward home, faces wearied but relieved. Their tasks were nearly done. They passed the baton to the day shift like runners in a marathon. Neither side fully understood. Stray dogs stretched in doorways, shook off the night, and trotted toward markets hoping for breakfast scraps. Cats who had ruled the rooftops for hours slipped away discreetly as if embarrassed to be caught in daylight. They vanished through fences, under carts, or into alleys, knowing that nighttime was their kingdom and daytime would never belong to them in the same way. Cab drivers heading home cracked their backs and rubbed sleep from their eyes. Horses, exhausted from a night of pulling omnibuses and cabs across uneven cobblestone, lowered their heads, grateful for the chance to rest. The drunks who had finally found their way home stumbled through their doors like ghosts finishing an exorcism. And the homeless, those who had spent the night folded into doorways or curled beneath bridges, shifted restlessly as the city began noticing them again. Some stood, preparing to move before they were shooed away. Others clung to the last minutes of anonymity that only darkness allowed. Sunrise itself arrived shyly at first, a pale smear of colour on the horizon, spreading through chimney smoke and morning fog. It gradually brightened into soft gold, illuminating rooftops, glimmering on icicles in winter, or glistening off wet stones after a night of rain. Windows brightened from within as households stirred. Curtains twitched, kettles whistled. The first doors opened with the familiar creak of domestic routine. With each passing minute, the city's dual reality, the nighttime version and the daytime one, parted ways. The eerie stillness dissolved. The strange characters melted away. The leftover chaos vanished under the brooms and carts of the sanitation crews. Street vendors prepared their daytime stalls, shop lifted shutters groaning from disuse. And the respectable morning world stepped outside, acting as though nothing unusual had happened mere hours earlier. That was the magic of Victorian sunrise. It had a talent for erasing, for covering over the wild nighttime cast of characters, for resetting the stage so completely that daytime residents could pretend the night's shadows belonged to another world entirely. And so, as smoke curled from chimneys, as milk bottles clinked, as lamps dimmed out of existence, the Victorian night handed the street back to civilization with a quiet, knowing nod, because it would be back again soon, bringing its mystery, danger, chaos, and secret life to the same cobblestones that now gleamed with morning light. And just like that, the city pretended nothing weird ever happened.